In the early morning hours of June the 6th, 1944, a massive Allied invasion force comprising some 5,000 ships, 1,200 aircraft, and 160,000 troops steamed across the English Channel toward the beaches of Normandy. It was the opening act of Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in history, and the battle that would finally secure an Allied foothold in Western Europe and mark the beginning of the end for the German Third Reich. The challenge facing the planners of Overlord was enormous, for the European coast was defended by the Atlantic Wall, a formidable chain of concrete bunkers, gun emplacements, minefields, and beach obstacles stretching from the tip of Norway to the Spanish border. If Overlord was to have any chance of succeeding, these fortifications had to be overcome. To this end, Allied engineers came up with a variety of weird and wonderful secret weapons, from specially modified tanks designed to swim ashore, clear minefields with whirling chains, and defeat bunkers with powerful mortars and flamethrowers, to giant floating harbours called Mulberry. They even had an undersea oil pipeline called Pluto to supply fuel to the thirsty invasion force. But perhaps the most outlandish device proposed for Overlord was a giant rocket-propelled Catherine wheel designed to roar up the invasion beaches and deliver a ton of explosives against enemy defenses. This is the story of the Great Panjandrum, the most hilariously absurd secret weapon of the Second World War. So in a previous video, we covered the development of the Hagile, a failed wartime scheme to airdrop cargo more quickly and accurately by using rockets rather than parachutes to slow its fall. Like Hagile, the Great Panjandrum was the brainchild of the British Admiralty's Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, or DMWD, a collection of eccentric scientists and engineers nicknamed the Wheezers and Dodgers, tasked with developing creative solutions to tough wartime problems. Among the DMWD's members was Sub-Lieutenant Neville Shute, an aeronautical engineer later to gain fame as the author of novels such as On a Beach and A Town Like Alice. When, in early 1943, the DMWD was given the task of developing a weapon capable of demolishing a reinforced concrete wall 10 feet tall and 7 feet thick, Shute calculated that it would take an explosive charge of at least 1 ton to blow a hole wide enough for a tank to roll through. Actually, getting such a charge to the wall, however, was another matter entirely, for the abundance of landmines, barbed wire entanglements, machine gun nests, and other defenses on the invasion beaches would make a manned demolition mission near certain suicide. The answer came in the form of RAF Wing Commander C.R. Finch Noyes, who had previously designed an early version of the bouncing bombs used in the famous Dam Busters raid of May 16, 1943. Noyes presented the boffins at DMWD with a sketch of a truly outlandish device, a pair of gigantic steel wheels, 10 feet in diameter and 1 foot wide, connected by a cylindrical drum containing 4,000 pounds of high explosive. Arranged around the rims of the reels were a battery of cordite solid-fuel rockets which would propel the device off a landing craft and up the beach at 60 miles per hour, skimming effortlessly over landmines and through barbed wire before crashing into the target, whereupon the wheels would collapse and their explosives would detonate against the base of the wall. Amazingly, Noyes' proposal was taken seriously, and within a month the prototype was constructed in great secrecy at a Leytonstone in northeast London and transported under cover of darkness to Appledore in Devon, headquarters of the Combined Operations Experimental Establishment, or COXE. This site was specifically designed to test secret weapons for the Overlord invasion, as the beaches in the area closely resembled those of Normandy. Shortly after arriving at COXE, Noyes' weapon was dubbed the Great Panjandrum, after a famous piece of nonsense verse by 18th century writer Samuel Foote, which ends with the line, "Till the gunpowder ran out at the heels of their boots." The first test of the Great Panjandrum was scheduled for September 7th, 1943, near a seaside resort town with the absurdly British name of Westward Ho. Despite the great secrecy which had attended the weapon's construction, the test was conducted in plain view of the public beaches and soon attracted a large crowd of curious onlookers. As such a device had never been constructed before, the DMWD team replaced the explosives in the central drum with the equivalent weight of sand and fitted the wheels with only 18 rockets. As the intrigued holidaymakers looked on, the ignition switch was thrown, the wheels erupted into brilliant rings of flame, and the Great Panjandrum trundled down the landing craft ramp across the surf and up onto the beach. At first, all went well and the strange weapon rolled straight and true, but soon rockets began failing and flying off the wheel, and the whole device veered off to the right and flipped over onto its side, ending its inauspicious first run stranded and wreathed in thick flame and smoke. Concluding that the Panjandrum was underpowered, the DMWD team doubled the number of rockets to 36 and moved the test site to Instow Beach near the Torridge River estuary. But while this upgraded version travelled twice as far up the beach, it also suffered from rocket shedding and wound up on its side. To improve stability, the engineers added a third central wheel and tried again, this time launching the Panjandrum from a wooden ramp mounted at the low tide line rather than an actual landing craft. Unfortunately, when the firing switch was thrown, nothing happened, and as the engineers struggled to find the fault in the wiring circuit, the tide washed in and engulfed the Panjandrum, causing the middle wheel to collapse. It was a pathetic but appropriately absurd end to the third test. 3 weeks later, the engineers returned once again with a new version of the Panjandrum, which dispensed with the central third wheel and increased the number of rockets to 70. To the team's delight, the weapon initially roared up the beach at its desired speed, but a moment later rockets once again began to fail and shear off, sending the Panjandrum careening back into the sea, where it overturned and the remaining rockets exploded, sending a giant column of spray up. Realizing that the original unguided concept was unworkable, the engineers next added a system of steering cables mounted to spools on the landing craft, which could be differentially braked to nudge the Panjandrum left or right. Neville Shute was placed in charge of operating these brakes, and as the new design roared off the launch ramp, it seemed as though the system might just work. However, after a few seconds, the Panjandrum began to veer off course, prompting Shute to tap the brakes to correct its trajectory. In response, the cable simply snapped, sending the Panjandrum careening once more into the ocean. At this point, the team's growing pessimism was relieved somewhat by DMWD's announcements that absolute accuracy was no longer deemed necessary. The Panjandrum just had to be capable of traveling in the general direction of the enemy. And so, in January 1944, a group of high-ranking military officials gathered at Devon to observe what would turn out to be the final test of this troublesome weapon. As author Brian Johnson recounts in his 1978 book, The Secret War, the results were less than surprising. At first, all went well. Panjandrum rolled into the sea and began to head for the shore. The brass hats watching through binoculars from the top of a pebble ridge. Then a clamp gave. First one, then 2 more rockets broke free. Panjandrum began to lurch ominously. It hit a line of small craters in the sand and began to turn starboard, careening towards cinematographer Louis Klemanski, who, viewing events through a telescopic lens, misjudged the distance and continued filming. Hearing the approaching roar, he looked up from his viewfinder to see the Panjandrum shedding live rockets in all directions, heading straight for him. As he ran for his life, he glimpsed the assembled admirals and generals diving for cover behind the pebble ridge into barbed wire entanglements. Panjandrum was now heading back to the sea, but crashed on the sand, where it disintegrated in violent explosions, rockets tearing across the beach at great speed. But perhaps the most memorable episode of the whole spectacle was when one army officer's Airedale dog, appropriately named Monal after the high explosive, chased after one of the careening rockets, nearly being killed in the process. Amazingly, the whole debacle was captured by Klemanski's camera and is now preserved online for posterity. Unsurprisingly, this spectacular failure marked the end of the Great Panjandrum, which, along with dozens of other weird and wonderful proposals, never made it to the beaches in Normandy. As with Agile, Panjandrum's failure lay mainly in the limitations of contemporary solid rockets, which were based on the gun propellant cordite and were difficult to ignite simultaneously. Indeed, in 2009, the town of Appledore celebrated the 65th anniversary of the D-Day landings by building and launching a 3/4 scale replica of Panjandrum, powered by modern solid rocket fuel rockets and packed with fireworks instead of high explosives, the recreated Panjandrum functioning exactly as Wing Commander Noyes had intended, rocketing 50 meters up the beach in a straight line. Strangely, however, it is possible that Panjandrum was actually intended to fail right from the start. A great deal of Operation Overlord's ultimate success was thanks to a massive deception campaign called Operation Bodyguard, which convinced the Germans that the target of the invasion was not Normandy, but the Pas-de-Calais. And for more on this, please do check out our previous video, The Bizarre Story of the Massive Fake Army that defeated the Nazis and helped end World War II. According to some historians, the Great Panjandrum was nothing more than a hoax, carried out in service of this overall deception. This theory makes a certain amount of sense, given that a weapon like Panjandrum would have been more useful against the heavier defenses of Calais than those of Normandy. The fact that the weapon was tested in plain sight of the public also calls into question the seriousness of the overall project. But as Canadian chemist Charles Goodeve, who headed the DMWD for much of the war, later revealed, we did much more unlikely things than Panjandrum. And given the many weird and wonderful World War II weapons and operations we've covered on this channel so far, that isn't difficult to believe at all. Moving on from the rocket-powered wheel bomb, during the war, Britain was taking a beating from the German ships and submarines, and was looking for something to build a ship out of that couldn't be destroyed by torpedoes, or at least could take a major pounding without incurring a fatal amount of damage. With steel and aluminium in short supply, Allied scientists and engineers were encouraged to come up with alternative materials and weapons. A scientist called Geoffrey Pike was the king of absurd inventions, as you'll hear about later in the bonus facts, along with his hilariously absurd but nonetheless effective method of escaping a German prison camp, which he did successfully using said method. But for now, the king of all of his countless alternative ideas was to build a 2,000-foot long, 300-foot wide, and 2-million-ton carrier. Pike named his project Habakkuk, a biblical reference that seemed to mirror the project's goal. Quote, "Be utterly amazed, for I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told." Unlike in the Bible, though, the ship's name was spelled with 2 B's and 1 K, which is thought to simply be a spelling error that was repeated so many times that it became official. Besides the ship's size, what was so different about Pike's vessel was that it was to be built out of ice. There is no real limit on the availability of ice. It's easy to make, fairly durable except in warm temperatures, buoyant, and very easy to repair when damaged. Further, repairs can be made extremely quickly with the right equipment, even during a battle. The ship was to include 40 dual-barreled gun turrets, as well as other anti-aircraft guns, and an airstrip that could accommodate 150 fighter planes or twin-engine bombers. Pike was able to sell Winston Churchill on his plan in 1942, including Churchill stating that it should be given the highest priority. In testing, though, it was discovered that ice might not be as strong as the icebergs that Pike modelled his idea on. It turned out that ice frozen into blocks for the hull could be broken very easily with something as small as a hammer. The project was temporarily abandoned as a result. However, later that year, a New York polytechnic firm added cellulose, sawdust, wood chips, and paper shreds to water and froze it for a much more promising base structure for a ship. Not only was it stronger than straight frozen water, with as little as 4% of wood pulp added to make it as strong as concrete, pound for pound, it was also much slower to melt and more buoyant. Pikery, named after Geoffrey Pike, could also be cut like wood and easily milled into shapes like metal. There was one problem, though. Melting and refreezing would cause warping in the structure. Tests showed that a Pikery ship would eventually sag unless consistently cooled to around 3 degrees Fahrenheit. To maintain this, the ship's surface would have to be covered in insulation, and it would need a refrigeration plant and duct system. To test the feasibility of getting around this problem, a small-scale version of the Habakkuk was constructed in Alberta, Canada's Lake Patricia, to experiment with insulation and refrigeration possibilities and see how it would stand up to artillery shelling. The test ship was 30 feet wide by 60 feet long, weighed 1,000 tons, and was kept refrigerated with a 1-horsepower engine, which was sufficient to keep it from melting even through the hot summer months. In ballistic testing, it was determined that a direct torpedo would cause only about a 10-foot crater in the hull, which was insignificant given the size of the proposed ship. Thus, it would be nearly impervious to torpedo attacks for all practical purposes, as it would take a huge number of torpedoes and other bombs to sink the ship. So even if the ship was broken up, the Axis powers would have to invest a massive amount of their resources in a given area to do it, particularly considering the arsenal of aircraft that the ship carried, which would have weakened them significantly on other fronts during the attack. If they were unsuccessful, the ship could be easily and quickly repaired right on the spot. So overall, the test ship made the full-size version seem like it might actually work out. Further, at this point, it was estimated that construction on a real Habakkuk would cost a minuscule $2.5 million, about $32 million today, which is an extreme bargain for a ship like this. However, there were still some hurdles to overcome. The rudder on the ship would have to be massive. How to effectively mount this on the structure in a way that would be resistant to attack was a problem, as was controlling such a rudder. Also, the amount of wood pulp needed would have impacted paper production. While this ship used significantly less steel than most, the steel tubing it did need for reinforcing the structure would also have depleted reserves for conventional proven warship. Further, a huge amount of cork would also be required to insulate the ship, and finally, the ship's top speed of just 6 to 7 knots was deemed too slow, even with it deemed being fairly torpedo-proof in terms of the main structure itself. In the end, these problems, combined with the fact that during the planning phase, the range of aircraft had increased significantly to the point where the need for a floating island became less necessary, ultimately sunk the planned ship. That said, while the plan to build Habakkuk was short-lived, its prototype was surprisingly resilient. It took 3 hot summers to completely melt the smaller version of the boat. Bonus facts. Speaking of Pike and absurd secret weapons, besides an ice ship, Pike once suggested using thousands of balloons with microphones and transmitters attached as a way of triangulating enemy positions. He was not aware at the time of advancements and development in radar technology. Yet another oddball invention Pike came up with to help the war was a screw-propelled snow vehicle. The vehicle would be propelled by having 2 cylinders with flanges in a screw thread-like fashion, spinning in opposite directions and varying their speed to facilitate turns. The M29 Weasel put an end to the potential of Pike's snow vehicle seeing the light of day. Yet another idea of Pike's was to use pikery to quickly construct buildings and protective barriers in a mobile war. In the end, this was deemed impractical given the amount of equipment, water, and pulp that would be needed to be lugged around. Another idea of Pike's, this one to solve the problem of transporting equipment from ships to shore in the many places where a harbour wasn't available, was to create massive pipe systems from the ships that would be extended to shore and beyond as the soldiers advanced, literal supply lines. Equipment could be packed in airtight containers that would be whisked through the pipes to the waiting soldiers. Ultimately, a more practical idea was developed using floating trucks and floating concrete structures. A similar idea was to extend the piping system to quickly transport not only equipment, but soldiers too, particularly over difficult-to-cross terrain. Soldiers would be given oxygen masks and propelled through the pipes via water flowing through. In order to get around the inevitable problem of soldiers panicking while they're whisked through these pipes that they can't get out of until they reach the end, he recommended drugging them first if they felt they'd have a problem with it. As he said, the whole experience of riding in a pipe, however, should be far less unpleasant and take much less time to become used to than parachute jumping or being bombed. Another of Pike's genius ideas, this time after the war, was to get around the energy crisis by having trains not be propelled by conventional fuels, but human power. His idea was to equip each train car with dozens of bicycle-like contraptions. Passengers would then be expected to pedal. This would cause people to eat more, needing more calories, which was a problem given post-war food shortages. Pike felt that this was fine because, while certain foods were in short supply, sugar was plentiful, and a pound of sugar converted to energy via human digestion would provide more energy than from burning a pound of coal or oil, which there was a shortage of. Despite only a few of his ideas having some merit to them, with most being amazingly impractical, Pike was kept around for a time simply because the Chief of Combined Operations, Louis Mountbatten, felt that Pike's steady stream of outlandish ideas was good for the other members of his staff to hear, to try and get them to think a bit more out of the box. One idea of Pike's that did pan out was his idea of how to escape from a German prison camp, the one he found himself in at the time. Most of his fellow prisoners thought he was crazy even then, as even if he was able to get out of the camp, it was felt he would either starve, be caught, or killed before getting out of Germany itself. He proved them all wrong, becoming the first to successfully escape from the camp that he was in. In his fashion, he meticulously studied all accounts of escape attempts to date by others and why and where they failed. He then devised a plan, at which point he and Edward Falk, a fellow inmate, began a rigorous exercise routine to prepare for their journey. His plan went as so, with the beginning being every bit as seemingly impractical as many of his other ideas, but nonetheless working. First, use the fact there was an athletic equipment shed that, while regularly checked by soldiers, was checked at a time of day when, if the sun was out and it was the right time of year, the sun's rays would glare off a window and cause the soldiers looking into the darkened shed not to be able to see properly. Thus, even though he and Falk could see the guard and weren't well hidden, the guard could not see them in the small shack. After hiding out, they then managed to slip out of the camp at night with the supply of food that they'd been rationing. Following a truly harrowing journey, they made it to what they thought was the border and were not caught by a German soldier, as they initially thought, but rather a Dutch one. They'd made it.
Prior to World War II, knowing that they couldn't compete with the numbers of the US Navy, the Imperial Japanese Navy quietly authorized the construction of the two largest battleships by weight ever seen in warfare, the Musashi and her sister ship, the Yamato. The origins of these two behemoths can be traced back to Japan's 1934 withdrawal from the League of Nations. Among other things, doing this allowed Japan to ignore rules set by the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 and the London Naval Treaty of 1930, both of which aimed to limit the size of battleships as well as the right of participating nations to construct them. Almost immediately following Japan's withdrawal, a team working for the Japanese Navy Technical Department, helmed by an engineer called Keiji Fukada, began submitting designs for a class of battleship superior in size and firepower to anything ever seen before. While initially planning to build 5 of these battleships, ultimately only 2 were completed, with a third being converted to an aircraft carrier midway through construction. The 2 completed ships, the Musashi and the Yamato, were quite literally in a class of their own, designed to displace some 73,000 long tons when fully equipped. For reference, the United States' Iowa-class battleships, created around the same time while of similar length, weighed about 40% less. As one Japanese officer, Naoyoshi Ishida, described, "How huge it is! When you walk inside, there are arrows telling you which direction is the front and which is the back, otherwise you can't tell. For a couple of days, I didn't even know how to get back to my own quarters. Everyone was like that. I knew it was a very capable battleship. The guns were enormous." On that note, not just big, these ships also featured 9 of the largest guns ever put on a battleship, with all 9 combined weighing approximately as much as the United States' Wyoming, New York, and Nevada-class battleships. These weapons were capable of firing shells that weighed up to 3,200 pounds, that's 1,450 kilograms, or in other words, in the ballpark of what a typical full-sized sedan car weighs. While you might think the range when shooting such an object must have been poor, in fact, these guns could hit a target over 25 miles, that's 40 kilometers away. They could also be fired at a rate of about once every 40 seconds. The shockwave produced by these guns firing was noted as being powerful enough to tear the skin off a human if an unlucky individual stood within 15 meters of it without proper shielding. This shockwave also resulted in nearby anti-aircraft guns having to be specially armored to protect them from the blast. Speaking of anti-aircraft guns, ultimately these ships were equipped with approximately 150 25mm guns. In between these and the massive 460mm cannons previously described, these ships also featured 6 155mm and 24 127mm guns. Further, if not needing the 460mm cannons for hitting ships far away, these battleships were equipped with so-called beehive rounds to fire from those cannons. In a nutshell, these rounds were filled with nearly 1,000 incendiary tubes and hundreds of shards of steel. The rounds also included a fuse and explosive that would cause the shell to explode out, with the incendiary tubes igniting shortly thereafter, producing a wall of flame and molten steel meant to absolutely obliterate enemy aircraft. Essentially, the idea here was to convert these guns into comically large shotguns, able to pick any enemy birds right out of the air. Armor-wise, each ship possessed on its outer shell a protective layer some 16 inches thick. While you might think that this all combined would make these ships incredibly slow, it turns out they had a top speed of about 27 knots or 31 miles per hour. While not the fastest battleship in the world, this compared favorably to, for instance, the aforementioned Iowa-class battleships that weighed about 40% less but could only go about 6 knots faster. Despite their awe-inspiring power and the full confidence of the Japanese military brass that each ship was unmatchable and unsinkable, neither saw much combat. In fact, the Yamato spent so much time protecting Japanese ports it was nicknamed the Hotel Yamato. The reluctance of the Japanese Navy to commit either ship to combat was motivated by both the scarcity of fuel in Japan during the war, with these battleships taking copious amounts of such to go anywhere, and the fact that the military brass believed losing either ship would be a massive blow to the morale of the rest of the Japanese military. Of course, in the closing months of World War II, with their forces almost completely obliterated, Japan reluctantly committed both battleships to naval engagements. Unfortunately, at this point, these super battleships were so absurdly outnumbered in the limited engagements they'd ultimately take part in that they mostly just functioned as sitting ducks. Most notably, they proved especially vulnerable to aircraft attacks. Even the aforementioned beehive rounds, which the Japanese believed would decimate aircraft, proved to be little more than a visual deterrent, with some American pilots simply flying straight through the flaming shrapnel that they produced. And while the near couple of hundred anti-aircraft guns made it so it took a brave pilot to dive-bomb the ships, the sheer number of aircraft that the Americans could throw at these battleships at the same time, and how chaotic the battles got, ultimately saw these guns prove just as worthless in practice. It didn't help that at this point in the war, Japan's own aircraft were ridiculously outnumbered and outclassed, providing little to no air cover to try and protect the massive battleships. Ultimately, the Musashi was lost during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944, taking 19 torpedoes and 17 bomb strikes to sink it. As for the Yamato, it took part in her final engagement in April of 1945 in Operation Tengo, which was an intentional suicide mission. The Yamato was to be the tip of the spear of this final, last-ditch effort to repel the American advance. Its crew was ordered to beach the ship near Okinawa and use its main battery to destroy as much of the invading force as possible. Essentially, the ship would function as a base on the island, and members of the near 3,000-strong crew not needed to operate weaponry aboard the ship were to wage a land battle with any enemy forces encountered. The mission plan was flawed from the outset, however, and performed under protest of some of the Japanese Navy brass involved. They noted that there would be no chance of even reaching the target island in the first place given the stated plan, including no air support whatsoever, and time of day they were to execute the plan, which was broad daylight. This turned out to be correct. En route on April the 7th, 1945, the Yamato and a handful of accompanying ships were completely and quickly overwhelmed by a combined assault force from 6 cruisers, 21 destroyers, 7 battleships, and a few hundred aircraft. One surviving member of the Yamato crew, Junior Officer Yoshida Mitsuru, had this to say of the battle that they had all known was a suicide mission from the start. How many times in target practice have we conducted such tracking? I am possessed by the illusion that we have already experienced searches under the same conditions, with the same battle positions, even with the same mood. What is going on before my very eyes, indisputably, is actual combat, but how can I possibly convince myself of that fact? The blips are not an imagined enemy, but an enemy poised for the kill. The location, not our training waters, but hostile waters. More than 100 enemy planes attacking. Is it the navigation officer that calls this out? The battle begins. As my whole body tingles with excitement, I observe my own exhilaration as I grit my teeth. I break into a grin. A sailor near me is felled by shrapnel. In the midst of the overwhelming noise, I distinguished the sound of his skull striking the bulkhead amid the smell of gunpowder all around. I smelled blood. The tracks of the torpedoes are a beautiful white against the water, as if someone were drawing a needle through the water. They come pressing in, aimed at Yamato from a dozen different directions and intersecting silently. Estimating by sight their distance and angle on the plotting board, we shift course to run parallel to the torpedoes and barely succeed in dodging them. We deal first with the closest, most urgent one. When we get to a point far enough away from it that we can be sure we have dodged it, we turn to the next. Dealing with them calls for vigilance, calculation, and decision. That these pilots repeated their attacks with accuracy and coolness was a sheer display of the unfathomable, undreamed of strength of our foes. In the end, it took only 2 hours for American forces to destroy the single most powerful ship ever constructed during World War II. When the smoke cleared, around 4,000 were dead on the Japanese side versus around just a dozen dead on the American side and a few more wounded. Get into those bonus facts. Early in World War II, the Imperial Japanese Navy had plans to construct even bigger ships than the Yamato and the Musashi as part of an even more powerful class of ships they called the Super Yamatos. If constructed, these ships would have possessed 510mm guns, displaced upwards of 82,000 tons, and could have moved at speeds approaching 30 knots. Lack of resources, however, stopped Japan from ever building these ships.
Driving over anti-tank guns, the remarkable Russian KV tanks. The KV-1 and the KV-2 are recognized as being amongst the most heavily armored tanks deployed during World War II. At least initially, they were largely impervious to anything less than a direct point-blank hit from a dedicated anti-tank weapon. The KV series, it was indeed so formidable that the first time the Wehrmacht encountered them, Soviet soldiers destroyed dozens of anti-tank guns by simply driving towards them in a straight line and running over them. Introduced in 1939 and named for famed Soviet officer Kliment Voroshilov, a man who once personally tried to attack a German tank division with a pistol, the KV series was designed to replace the T-35 heavy tank, which was somewhat mechanically unreliable, and it was also costly to produce. As you might have guessed from our earlier description, well, these tanks, they were effectively designed with a single feature in mind, and that was survivability. Towards this end, the tanks were equipped with exceptionally thick armor. This thickness, it did vary somewhat based on model. For reference, the KV-1 boasted armor that was 90mm thick, that's 3.5 inches on the front, and 70mm thick, that's 2.8 inches on the rear and sides. Now, of course, there is always a trade-off in anything, and the thickness and weight of the KV's armor came at the expense of almost everything else. The tank was slow, had limited maneuverability and firepower relative to what you'd expect from a tank that size, and to top it all off, it had exceptionally poor visibility. In fact, it's noted that Soviet commanders frequently complained about the tank despite the defensive protection that it offered. These sentiments weren't echoed by the German troops who initially encountered this moving shield, though. The KV-1 and KV-2, the two most popular models of the tank, were nearly invincible during initial skirmishes with the Germans, as few anti-tank weapons they possessed could punch a hole through the armor, and even the ones that could required uncomfortably close range to do it. As noted by an unspecified German soldier in a 1949 report compiled by the US Army's Historical Division, there suddenly appeared for the first time a battalion of heavy enemy tanks of previously unknown type. They overran the armored infantry regiment and broke through into the artillery position. The projectiles of all defense weapons, except the 88mm flak, bounced off the thick enemy armor. Our 100 tanks were unable to check the 20 enemy dreadnoughts and suffered losses. Several Czech-built tanks, T-36s, that had bogged down in the grain fields because of mechanical trouble were flattened by the enemy monsters. The same fate befell a 150mm medium howitzer battery, which kept on firing until the last minute. Despite the fact that it scored direct hit after direct hit from as close a range as 200 meters, its heavy shells were unable to put even a single tank out of action. In another account, a German soldier in the 1st Panzer Division noted, "The KV-1 and KV-2 which we first met here were really something. Our companies opened fire at about 800 yards, but they remained ineffective. We moved closer and closer to the enemy, who, for his part, continued to approach us unconcerned. Very soon we were facing each other at 50 to 100 yards. A fantastic exchange of fire took place without any visible German success. The Russian tanks continued to advance, and all armor-piercing shells simply bounced off them. Thus, we were presently faced with the alarming situation of the Russian tanks driving through the ranks of 1st Panzer Regiment towards our own infantry and our hinterland. Our Panzer Regiment therefore turned about and rumbled back with the KV-1s and KV-2s roughly in line with them. The former report also notes that a lone KV tank, the exact model isn't clear, simply parked in the middle of the road, blocking the main supply route, and sat there soaking up anti-tank rounds for several days. To quote, "There were practically no means of eliminating the monster. It was impossible to bypass the tank because of the swampy surrounding terrain." Among the initial armaments brought against the troublesome tank were 4 50mm anti-tank guns. One by one, the tank took them all out, suffering no meaningful damage itself. Frustrated, the Germans commanded a nearby 88mm anti-aircraft gun, positioning it a few hundred feet behind the tank. This is basically point-blank range for a gun that is designed to rip planes in half. While this weapon was capable of piercing the tank's armor at that range, before they could fire, the KV turned the gun's crew into a pink smear. Next up, the Germans decided to send in an engineer crew in the cover of darkness to see if they could take it out up close and personal. While they did manage to get to the KV and attach demolition charges, it turned out they underestimated the needed explosive power, and only a few pieces of the tank's track were destroyed, leaving the tank still fully functional. As for the tank crew themselves, they initially received needed supplies to continue their barrage on the Germans via the cover of night. However, ultimately the Germans were able to cut off supply access to the tank and then sent a whopping 50 of their own tanks in to take it out, or that appeared to be their plan. While the massive number of tanks were approaching and occupying the attention of the KV crew with their limited visibility, the Germans were able to, according to the 1949 account from the unnamed German soldier, set up in camouflage another 88 Ram, flanked the rear of the tank so that this time it was actually able to fire. Of the 12 direct hits, 3 pierced the tank and destroyed it. Of course, all good things must come to an end, and the KV line's many limitations saw it quickly go from a near-impervious mobile fortress to a virtual sitting duck, with German forces reacting to it by developing new explosive anti-tank rounds fully capable of taking the KVs out. While still used throughout the war, once this happened, the KVs were largely replaced by the more well-rounded T-34 tank. Still, it's impossible to argue that the KV didn't make one hell of a first impression, even if, ironically enough, it didn't have any staying power.
On December 8th, 1941, the day after the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States declared war on the Empire of Japan. 3 days later, on December 11th, Japan's ally Nazi Germany declared war on the US. This was to prove a major strategic blunder for the Nazis, for not only was the United States the greatest industrial power in the world, but its geographic isolation from both Germany and Japan made it nearly invulnerable to enemy attack. While the U-boats of the German Kriegsmarine scored impressive victories against Allied shipping early in the war, by 1943 the sheer volume of merchant vessels being churned out by American shipyards plus advancements in anti-submarine technology and tactics had all but secured Allied supremacy over the Atlantic. After that, the only way America could be attacked was from the air, something no existent German aircraft was capable of. This, however, didn't stop the Nazis from trying, and throughout the war, German engineers came up with a variety of ambitious designs for a so-called America bomber, an aircraft capable of flying 6,000 kilometers from Germany to New York City and taking the fight to the enemy. While most of these designs consisted of giant, multi-engined bombers, one proposal stood out among the rest. Impressively prophetic, this design was so fantastically advanced that a vehicle of its type would not be successfully flown for another 4 decades. This is a story of the Silbervogel, the Nazi space shuttle that never was. Since the earliest days of science fiction, most writers assumed that future spacecraft would be similar to sailing ships or other aircraft, largely reusable vehicles that could fly to and from space multiple times before needing to be repaired or overhauled. Though theoretically this approach permits enormous cost savings over single-use spacecraft, in practice the added complexity of designing a reusable spaceplane nearly always outweighs these savings. Consequently, over the past 60 years, most astronauts have traveled into space aboard simple single-use ballistic capsules. However, this has not deterred designers from trying to crack the problem of reusable spacecraft, and among the first attack of this challenge was a German engineer named Eugene Sanger. Born in 1905 in the town of Presnitz in what is now the Czech Republic, Sanger initially pursued studies in civil engineering at the Technical Universities of Graz and Vienna in Austria. However, during his studies, Sanger read the influential book By Rockets to Planetary Space by pioneering rocketry theorist Hermann Oberth, and like many young engineers of his day, was inspired to change his field of study to aeronautics. Around this time, he also joined the Society for Space Travel, which counted among its members Oberth and a young Werner von Braun, future father of the the V-2 ballistic missile and the Saturn V moon rocket. Befitting his newfound passion, Sanger attempted to write his thesis on the subject of rocket flight, but this was rejected by the university as too fanciful. He finally graduated in 1929 after submitting a more mundane thesis on the statics of wing trusses. In 1936, Sanger published his rejected thesis as a book titled Rocket Flight Engineering, in which he laid out a unique concept for achieving high-speed, long-distance flight using a rocket-powered spaceplane. Rather than entering orbit, Sanger's proposed spaceplane would climb up to just above the atmosphere and descend on a ballistic trajectory. The flat fuselage of the craft would be specially designed to generate lift, causing it to skip off the atmosphere like a stone skipping across a pond. Due to atmospheric drag, each skip would be progressively shorter than the last, but if the velocity and the re-entry angle were properly calculated, such a craft could theoretically travel halfway around the world in mere minutes. Today, this type of flight profile is referred to as a non-ballistic atmospheric entry, or boost glide. These ideas caught the attention of the Reich Air Ministry, who saw Sanger's rocket glider as a potential means of attacking the continental United States from Germany. In 1936, the ministry established a laboratory near Braunschweig in Lower Saxon, where Sanger could develop the 100-ton thrust rocket engine needed to make his futuristic spacecraft possible. Here, he worked alongside a team of technicians and mathematician Irene Brett, who Sanger would later marry in 1951. Together, Sanger and Brett worked out many of the theoretical problems with boost glide flight, including the ideal shape for the spacecraft's lifting body fuselage and the massive frictional and compression heating the vehicle would encounter as it re-entered the atmosphere. They also pioneered one of the key developments in rocket engine design, regenerative cooling. The burning propellants in a rocket engine produce extremely high temperatures which easily can melt ordinary aerospace materials like aluminium. While combustion chambers and nozzles can be built of more heat-resistant materials like steel, these add weight to the engine's structure, reducing its performance. Sanger and Brett's solution was to circulate the fuel through a double-walled chamber and nozzle wall prior to injecting it into the engine. This simultaneously wicked away combustion heat and pre-pressurized the fuel, allowing the engine to be made far lighter and far more efficient. This basic design is used in nearly all liquid-fueled rocket engines to this day. On December 3, 1941, Sanger presented his final proposal to the Air Ministry. Dubbed Silbervogel or Silver Bird, Sanger's spaceplane looked like something straight out of science fiction. 28 meters long and weighing 10 tons, the craft featured a wide, streamlined hull with a flat bottom for skipping over the atmosphere, as well as stubby wings and a small twin tail. The majority of the internal volume was devoted to tanks of kerosene and liquid oxygen propellant to feed the single rocket engine, leaving only minimal space for the pilot and weapons payload. The craft was to be launched horizontally on a 3-kilometer track using a rocket sled whose cluster of 6 liquid-fueled engines would accelerate it to nearly 2,000 kilometers per hour in only 10 seconds. Once airborne, Silbervogel would fire its own engine for 168 seconds, reaching a speed of 21,800 kilometers per hour, nearly 18 times the speed of sound, and an altitude of 145 kilometers, well above where most consider space to have begun. The aircraft would then enter the boost glide phase, skipping its way across the Atlantic Ocean towards the United States. Once over New York or another target city, the pilot would open the bomb bay doors and release his 4,000-kilogram payload, his extreme speed and altitude making him invulnerable to enemy aircraft. As Nazi Germany never came close to developing an atomic bomb for maximum destructive effect, this payload would likely have been a dirty bomb composed of radioactive material wrapped around a conventional explosive core. And for more on this, please do check out our video on how close did the Nazis actually come to building an atomic bomb. As there was no way for Silbervogel to turn around and head back to Germany, Sanger proposed that it continued gliding over the North American continent to the Pacific Ocean, where it would land on an island occupied by Germany's ally Japan, a total journey of up to 24,000 kilometers. Though decades ahead of its time, Sanger's technically dense 900-page proposal failed to impress the Air Ministry, who filed it away and decided to focus on simpler, more conventional technology for the American bomber. The Braunschweig team were disbanded and Sanger was reassigned to the German Gliding Research Institute in Darmstadt. There, he carried out research on ramjet engines and worked on the design of the Skoda Kauber P-14 ramjet interceptor, one of many hastily conceived emergency fighters developed in the final days of the war in a desperate attempt to stem the tide of Allied bombers. In 1944, Sanger and Brett submitted an edited version of the 1941 Silbervogel proposal to the Air Ministry under the title A Rocket Drive for Long-Range Bombers, but once again it was rejected. In the end, 4 major designs were submitted to the American bomber program, all conventional multi-engine bombers: the Messerschmitt Me-264, the Focke-Wulf TA-400, the Junkers Ju-390, and the Heinkel He-277. Of these, only the Messerschmitt and the Junkers entries were actually built, with the Junkers Ju-390 ultimately being selected for production. However, only 2 prototypes were ever completed, and none entered service before the end of the war. Several other schemes were proposed to attack America from Germany, including the unusual Huckepack or piggyback concept. This involved mounting a modified Dornier Do-217 light bomber on the back of a Heinkel He-117 heavy bomber, which would carry its passenger as far as possible before releasing it and returning to Germany. The light bomber would then fly the rest of the way to the target, then ditch in the ocean, where a U-boat would be waiting to rescue the crew. While the plan was seriously considered, a lack of fuel and the loss of the Luftwaffe airbase at Bordeaux prevented a full-scale test flight. Furthermore, the Kriegsmarine refused to spare any U-boats, effectively killing the project. Meanwhile, Werner von Braun and his team of rocket engineers at Peenemünde in northern Germany proposed a supersized version of their infamous V-2 ballistic missile that would be capable of reaching North America. Dubbed the A-10 or America Rocket, the rocket would have measured 14 meters tall, weighed over 14 tons, and been able to cover a distance of 5,000 kilometers in around 35 minutes. As guidance systems at the time were not sophisticated enough to provide the desired accuracy at such ranges, the craft was designed to be manned, with the unfortunate pilot using radio beacons mounted aboard U-boats to guide the 1-ton warhead on its final suicidal descent. In 1943, Otto Laferenz, director of the Deutsche Arbeitsfront labor organization, also submitted a proposal for launching ordinary V-2s from U-boats off of the American coast. Codenamed Project Schwimmweste or Project Life Jacket, Laferenz's proposal involved the construction of a 500-ton watertight canister to be towed behind a U-boat, which would contain 1 rocket and tanks for its alcohol and liquid oxygen propellants. When close to the target, the U-boat crew would flood compartments in the rear of the canister to make it float upright, then fuel and launch the rocket. The canister would then be scuttled and the U-boat would return to base. Though 1 prototype launch canister was completed, the concept, like the A-10 America Rocket and Eugen Sanger's Silbervogel, was never tested before the war came to an end. Nonetheless, these concepts proved prophetic, presaging the intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine-launched ballistic missiles of today. But for all the advanced concepts it incorporated, Silbervogel would most likely never have worked as designed. Post-war analysis revealed that Sanger and Brett severely underestimated the heat load their craft would encounter on re-entry, meaning that Silbervogel and its unfortunate test pilot would likely have burned up on the first atmospheric skip. The problem could theoretically have been solved by thickening the heat shield, but this would have reduced the useful bomb payload to practically nothing, rendering the aircraft useless as a weapon. Nonetheless, its design would prove hugely influential on the field of spacecraft design. After the war, Eugen Sanger and Irene Brett moved to France, where in 1949 they founded the Fédération Aéronautique. In 1954, they returned to Germany, where Sanger directed jet engine research in Stuttgart and consulted for Junkers aircraft before dying in 1964 at the age of 59. It was while living in France that the Sangers survived a botched kidnapping attempt by Soviet agents. After occupying the Peenemünde research facility, Red Army troops discovered a copy of Sanger and Brett's Silbervogel proposal. The idea intrigued Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, who dispatched his son Vasily and engineer Grigory Ducati to convince the Sangers to come to the Soviet Union. However, the 2 would-be agents were unsuccessful, as were NKVD agents sent to take the couple by force. Despite lacking Sanger's expertise, in 1946 the Soviets set up a design bureau under the direction of mathematician Mstislav Keldysh to develop their own spaceplane. Realizing that the sheer volume of propellant needed to feed a liquid rocket engine would have given Silbervogel a negligible useful bomb load, Keldysh instead fitted his design with more efficient ramjets, creating a vehicle capable of carrying a practical nuclear weapon over a range of 12,000 kilometers. However, Keldysh estimated that the design would not be ready until the late 1950s, by which point it would likely be rendered obsolete by simpler intercontinental ballistic missiles. As a result, the Keldysh bomber was quietly shelved. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Sanger's ideas were gaining traction thanks to one Major General Walter Dornberger, the military head of the V-2 ballistic missile program. After the war, Dornberger, along with many German rocket scientists, were brought to the United States as part of Operation Paperclip. After developing ballistic missiles for the United States Air Force, Dornberger worked in the private aerospace sector, becoming vice president of Bell Aircraft and consulting for North American Aircraft and Boeing. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, Dornberger attempted to sell the United States military on the concept of a boost glide spaceplane like Sanger's Silbervogel, which he dubbed dubbed the antipodal bomber. Following the launch of Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite, on October 4th, 1957, the Air Force finally approved Dornberger's concept under the designation X-20 Dinosaur, short for Dynamic Soarer. Other names included the Rocket Bomber or Robo, Bomber Missile or BOMI, Brass Bell, and Hypersonic Strategic Weapon System. Measuring 11 meters long with 6 meters wingspan, the dart-shaped, flat-bottomed Dinosaur was designed to be launched into space atop a modified Titan II ballistic missile. While boost glide missions were possible, the craft was also capable of reaching orbit like the later Space Shuttle. Once in orbit, the single pilot could carry out a variety of missions, such as orbital bombardment of enemy targets, orbital reconnaissance with cameras and other sensors stored in a small equipment bay, or rendezvousing with and repairing satellites in orbit. Uniquely among spacecraft of the era, the Dinosaur's aerodynamic lifting body shape would have allowed it to very efficiently change its orbital inclination by briefly dipping into the atmosphere. To protect the craft against the heat of re-entry, it was built of high-temperature nickel superalloys, while its stubby wings and wire brush skids would have allowed it to glide to a runway landing like a regular aircraft. In April 1960, 7 astronauts were secretly selected for the Dinosaur program, including Neil Armstrong. However, the project soon began running into problems, the biggest being what the X-20 was even for. As rocket and guidance technology continued to improve, it quickly became clear that nuclear bombardment could be more easily and cheaply carried out using ballistic missiles and orbital reconnaissance using unmanned spy satellites than with a complex manned spaceplane. This, combined with confusion over what booster to use, Department of Defense budget cuts, and a government decree placing all manned spaceflight under the purview of NASA, led to the project being cancelled in 1963. It was not until April 12, 1981, that the first successful winged spacecraft, the Space Shuttle Columbia, was launched into orbit, finally making Eugen Sanger's prophetic vision a reality. But it was only a partial realization, for due to a long list of design compromises, the Space Shuttle was never able to achieve the massive cost savings promised by reusable spacecraft. Thus, following the shuttle's retirement in 2011, the world returned to using reliable, relatively inexpensive ballistic missile capsules to get into space. In the era of big data, few figures are more divisive than that of the hacker. On the one hand, malicious or black hat hackers cause billions of dollars in damage every year, breaking into private and public networks to steal money or personal data, or simply to create chaos. On the other hand, so-called ethical or white hat hackers use their skills in the service of the public good, either by probing computer systems for security weaknesses or leaking information on government corruption and other crimes. While mostly associated with the modern digital age, the art of hacking goes back nearly 100 years. And one of the earliest hackers was also one of the most ethical, using his skills to save millions of French citizens from the Nazis during the Second World War. This is the remarkable story of René Carmille. The era of big data is a lot older than you might think, tracing its origins back to the 1880s and a daunting problem facing the United States government. The US Constitution mandates that a census be taken every 10 years so that taxes and political representation can be updated according to the changing population. The first US census took place in 1790, and for the next 90 years, census data was collected and processed entirely by hand. In 1880, however, the Census Bureau faced a major crisis. The US population had grown so large that the 1880 census took a full 9 years to complete. By the time that data was ready to use, it was already time for the next census. And at this rate, the Bureau feared future censuses would never be able to catch up, rendering the entire exercise pointless. Enter Herman Hollerith, American engineer who had worked on the 1880 census. In 1889, Hollerith patented an ingenious system for speeding up the tabulating of census data based on the technology of punched cards. While punched cards had previously been used to automate the weaving of complex textile patterns, Hollerith's system was the first to apply them practically to the field of data processing. Hollerith was inspired by a system introduced by the railroads to help identify and catch train robbers and other criminals. As photography at the time was a slow, cumbersome process, train tickets were instead printed with a series of physical descriptors such as height, eye color, and facial hair, which the conductor could fill out using a standard ticket punch. In this manner, a rough description of each passenger could be recorded. Hollerith realized that this system could easily be adapted to the census and designed his own punch cards to record census data and a piano-sized machine called a tabulator to read and process it. The Hollerith system worked as follows. Census takers would travel around the country and record data like the number, ages, and sex of the people in each household by punching holes in the corresponding fields on the Hollerith cards. These cards would then be sent back to the Census Bureau for processing. An operator would insert the cards into the tabulator one by one through a hinged hatch, rather like a modern flatbed scanner or photocopier. When the hatch was closed, a grid of spring-loaded metal pins was forced against the card. Where a hole had been punched, the pin passed through and made contact with a pool of mercury, completing an electrical circuit. This data was counted and displayed on a series of clock-like dials on the face of the tabulator to be manually read and recorded by the operator. The genius of the tabulator, however, lay in its ability to be rewired or reprogrammed to count different combinations of data, for example, unmarried males under the age of 30. Hollerith also invented a device called a sorter, consisting of 13 vertical metal bins with spring-loaded lids, each of which could be programmed to collect a different combination of data. So, if, for example, the operator inserted a card which included an unmarried male under 30, the bin lid programs with that combination would pop open so the operator could drop the card in. The Hollerith system was adopted by the Census Bureau just in time for the 1890 census, and its impact was dramatic. The use of punched cards and tabulators cut the time required to process the census data down from 9 to 2 years. This dramatic improvement in efficiency led to Hollerith machines becoming standard equipment at the Census Bureau, and in 1896, Hollerith founded the Hollerith Tabulating Machine Company to sell his machines commercially. Among his first clients were the Prudential Life Insurance Company and the New York Central Railroad, the latter of which processed nearly 4 million freight waybills every year and was an ideal fit for the Hollerith system. Over the next decade, Hollerith introduced a number of key innovations which made his system increasingly more efficient and powerful, including redesigned punched cards, improved key punches for filling out those cards, printers for automatically tabulating data, automatic card feeders and sorters, and plug boards to allow the tabulators to be reprogrammed without having to physically rewire the circuitry. These innovations created a brand new industry, and Hollerith-style tabulators, now known as unit record machines, were adopted by a vast array of businesses for data-heavy tasks like processing invoices and payrolls. And with that, the information age had arrived. But for Herman Hollerith, success was not to last. In 1903, the new director of the Census Bureau, Simon North, decided that Hollerith had too much of a monopoly on data processing and banned the company's machines from the Bureau. Then, in 1911, through stock acquisition, the Tabulating Machine Company was merged with 4 other companies to create the Computing Tabulating Company. Finally, in 1923, this amalgamated company changed its name to International Business Machines, better known as IBM. Under the direction of CEO Thomas Watson, IBM would go on to dominate the unit record and later the digital computer industry, controlling over 90% of all punch card equipment in the United States by 1950. One of the keys to IBM's success was that they never sold their machines to clients. They only ever leased them. At one point, IBM even considered charging its clients for every individual punch card they used, a practice which would have netted them even more obscene profits. However, for the United States government, this was a step too far, and in 1932 IBM was taken to court for violating the 1914 Clayton Antitrust Act. Though IBM argued that the cards for which they held the patent were technically a component of the machines that they were already leasing to clients, in 1936 the government ultimately ruled against them. While IBM was allowed to specify the design of the cards used in its machines, clients were free to acquire the cards themselves from any source they wanted, including manufacturing them themselves. However, even this attempt to extort clients over individual punch cards was far from the most unethical activity that IBM would ever be involved in. The outbreak of the Second World War saw a dramatic surge in business for IBM. Not only did millions of fighting men and tons of military equipment need to be processed for deployment overseas, but unit record equipment quickly found new applications in the field of cryptanalysis. IBM punch card equipment proved ideally suited to searching endless reams of enciphered enemy signals, searching for rare repeats that could help crack the cipher key, a tedious task that had previously been done entirely by hand. Dozens of IBM machines were used at Allied code-breaking centers like Bletchley Park in Buckinghamshire and Arlington Hall in Washington, D.C., where they helped to penetrate enemy ciphers like Nazi Germany's Enigma and Imperial Japan's Purple, and shorten the war by an estimated 2 years. But IBM equipment would also be put to far more sinister uses. Like dozens of American companies like Ford, General Motors, Chase Manhattan Bank, and Coca-Cola, IBM did not allow the outbreak of war to interfere with its international business dealings, even those with Nazi Germany. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, the new government put out a tender for a census of the German people. By this point, the Nazis had already expelled all Jewish lawyers, doctors, scientists, and other professionals from their jobs and it was abundantly clear that the true goal of this census was to identify and persecute the remaining Jews and other undesirables in Germany. Indeed, in a public statement, Reinhard Kohr, a statistician working for the Nazi government, sinisterly announced that, in using statistics, the government now has the roadmap to switch from knowledge to deeds. Nonetheless, Thomas Watson, the CEO of IBM, instructed the company's German subsidiary, Die Homag, to bid on the contract, which they ultimately won. Over the next decade, hundreds of IBM unit record machines, along with spare parts and punch cards, were shipped to Germany, where they were immediately put to use in organizing what would eventually become the Holocaust. Machines were set up in headquarters of the SS Rassenamt, or race office, and even in concentration camps like Dachau, where millions of German Jews, Roma, communists, homosexuals, and other groups deemed politically or racially inferior were systematically identified, categorized, and earmarked for arrest, imprisonment, deportation, forced labor, or extermination. Shockingly, IBM and its subsidiary did far more than simply provide the Nazis with equipment, also sending hundreds of technicians to Germany to train SS personnel on how to use and maintain the temperamental equipment. These technicians also developed custom punch cards and special codes to help the SS designate and process concentration camps, prisoner types, and causes of death. For example, Auschwitz was 001, Buchenwald was 002, Dachau 003, and so on. 3 designated a homosexual, 9 an antisocial, and 8 a Jew, while 3 represented death from natural causes, 4 summary execution, 5 death by suicide, and 6 by special treatment, the euphemism for extermination via gas chamber. Given this intimate involvement, it's highly unlikely that IBM was unaware of what its machines were being used for, yet the flow of equipment and personnel continued unabated. In fact, so instrumental was IBM to the Nazis' policy of genocide that in 1937 Adolf Hitler awarded Thomas Watson the Order of the German Eagle for his services to the Third Reich, an honor bestowed on several other American Nazi sympathizers, including Henry Ford and Charles Lindbergh. And for more on the Lone Eagle's relationship with the Nazis, please check out our sister channel's video, Lucky Lindy and Advancing Medical Science, on the channel Highlight History, link below. The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 should have ended the company's dealings with Nazi Germany, and indeed, in June 1940, Thomas Watson returned his Order of the German Eagle. But while IBM publicly feigned remorse for its pre-war actions, in the background, their collaboration with the Nazis carried on as before. In 1939, Watson authorized the shipment to Germany of special IBM alphabetizing machines, which were used to round up and execute millions of Jews, intellectuals, and other undesirables during the Nazi conquest of Poland. So complicit was Watson in this policy that he even bankrolled the construction of concrete bunkers at Dachau to protect its IBM machines from British air raids. The Nazi government offered to buy the Homag outright, giving IBM the opportunity to make a clean break from its subsidiary, but Watson refused, and the Homag remained under the direct control of IBM headquarters in New York. Oh my god, IBM's a bit of a piece of isn't it? Oh my god. Don't buy IBM, allegedly. In 1940, Watson directly managed the establishment of a Dutch subsidiary tasked with identifying and rounding up that country's Jews. Aided by the Netherlands' existing Hollerith machine infrastructure and a long Dutch tradition of recording religion in the national census, this effort resulted in the murdering of 102,000 of the Netherlands' 140,000 Jews, an extermination rate of 73%. In every territory they conquered, the Nazis immediately carried out a census to identify and round up its racial and political enemies, a process made all the more efficient by IBM equipment. But when the Nazis rolled into France in June 1940, they finally met their match in an unassuming civil servant named René Carmel. Born in 1886, Carmel served in the French army during the First World War, first as an artillery commander and later in the military intelligence service. In 1924, he was appointed comptroller of the army, in which role he oversaw the adoption of Hollerith tabulating machines to improve the efficiency of army logistics. After transferring to the civil service in the 1930s, Carmel established the National Demographic Statistical Office, which pioneered the use of IBM punch card machines in the tabulating of the French census. With war clouds looming, Carmel's department undertook the creation of a national register of military-aged men fit for mobilization in the coming conflict. As part of this effort, Carmel invented the Social Security number, which he based on each person's date and place of birth. This system of unique numbers, he realized, was less cumbersome and prone to accidental overlap than categorizing people by their first and last names, and is still used in France to this day. Following the German invasion and partition of France, Carmel went to work for the collaborationist Vichy regime in the so-called Free Zone of southern France. But Carmel was no Nazi sympathizer. As a member of the French resistance, Carmel made it his mission to sabotage the German administration of France in any way that he could. His first order of business was to carry on with the creation of the National Register. While presented to the Germans as merely a routine civil project, the real purpose of the registry was to secretly prepare the French army for a sudden remobilization. During the winter of 1941 to 1942, Carmel identified the names of 220,000 demobilized soldiers living in the south of France, grouping them by unit and region. He prepared a set of punched cards that would trigger the printing and distribution of mobilization orders across the country in a matter of hours. However, Nazi racial policies soon began to interfere with this project. In 1941, Joseph Barthélemy, the Vichy Minister of Justice, instructed Carmel to identify Jewish citizens in his register. Fortunately, France had a long tradition of secularism, as never recorded religion in any prior census, and Carmel argued successfully that, given the civil nature of the project, he was unable to comply. Thus, the registry only recorded citizens' date and place of birth, as well as parents, marriages and divorces, children, date of death, nationality, current address and sex. So massive was this project that for nearly 2 years, Carmel was able to deny his department's equipment and services to the Vichy police and the Gestapo, forcing them to rely on traditional paper-based methods for identifying and tracking down Jews. In 1942, however, the Nazis annexed the Free Zone and took control of all of France, forcing Carmel to abandon the National Register and hide all evidence of the project in a Jesuit seminary. Even worse, the National Demographic Statistical Office came under the direct control of the Nazis, who forced Carmel to conduct a new census aimed at identifying French Jews. Unable to refuse directly, Carmel instead adopted a policy of passive resistance, seeking to obstruct and slow the data collection process as much as possible. He issued verbal rather than written instructions in order to delay responses and to sow confusion, instructed his staff to mishandle punch cards, and even hacked the IBM machines so they would never punch the 11th column indicating a citizen's race or religion, rendering the whole exercise useless to the Nazis. Meanwhile, Carmel's resistance network sent agents to London with samples of the punch cards used by the Vichy regime and used death notices received by the Statistical Service to create false identity cards for resistance members and Jewish citizens. So effective was Carmel's program of sabotage that by February 1944, the digital report on the number of French and foreign Jews counted in June 1941 was still not complete. By this time, however, the Germans had caught on to what Carmel was doing, and he was arrested in Lyon on February 3rd, 1944. After being tortured for 2 days by Gestapo officers Klaus Barbie, the infamous butcher of Lyon, Carmel was sent to the Dachau concentration camp, where he died of typhus on January 5th, 1945. While it can never be known how many French citizens Carmel's sabotage saved, compared to the Netherlands' extermination rate of 74%, only 25% of France's Jews were murdered by the Nazis. Despite collaborating with the Third Reich through all 12 years of the regime's existence, neither Thomas Watson nor IBM ever faced justice for their role in the Holocaust. In 2002, a group of 5 Romani Holocaust survivors filed a lawsuit against the company, but after 2 years of review, the case was dismissed on account of the statute of limitations having run out. But the death and destruction wrought with the assistance of the tech giant could have been far worse, if not for men like René Carmel. In many ways, René epitomizes the ethical hacker ethos of David versus Goliath. Though neither a general or a soldier or a powerful politician, Carmel managed to use the limited technological power at his disposal to save millions of his fellow citizens during one of the darkest chapters in human history. In the early morning hours of June 13th, 1944, the residents of East London were awoken by an unusual sound, a loud, high-pitched chugging like a motorcycle with a broken muffler. Looking up, they saw a small aircraft skimming over the rooftops at a tremendous speed, a tongue of flame trailing from its tail. Moments later, the aircraft plunged into the ground in Bethnal Green, and a massive explosion shook the ground. The blast shattered windows, crumbled brick walls, and blew the Great Eastern Railway Bridge over Grove Road in half. When the smoke and dust settled, 6 people lay dead and 30 severely injured. Over the following days, rescue crews combed through the rubble for the remains of the crashed aircraft and its crew. They found none, Because there were none. London had just come under attack by a new kind of weapon, an unmanned, jet-powered flying bomb. The Germans called it V1, the British the buzz bomb or Doodlebug. Over the following year, thousands of V1s would rain down on London and other cities, killing and injuring many thousands in turn, and forcing the British to turn to increasingly desperate measures to stem the tide, including one of the boldest and most badass tactics in the history of aerial warfare. This is a story of how one of Nazi Germany's most effective wonder weapons was finally defeated. The V1 was the brainchild of Fritz Guslau and Robert Lusser, engineers at the Berlin-based Argus Motor & Company. During the 1930s, Argus perfected a new type of propulsion system known as the pulse jet, originally invented by engineer Paul Schmidt. Among the simplest forms of jet propulsion, a pulse jet consists of a tapered metal tube with spring-loaded shutter valves at one end, a fuel injector and a spark plug for ignition. When the fuel is injected and ignited, the increase in pressure causes the shutter valves to close, forcing the combustion gases to exit out of the rear of the engine. The resulting partial vacuum then causes the shutter valves to open, letting in fresh air which mixes with the fuel and ignites, starting the cycle anew. This cycle, which repeats around 500 times per minute, produces the pulse jet's distinctive buzzing or chugging sound. Once the engine is started, the spark plug is no longer needed, as the acoustics of the tube maintain a stable flame front that ignites the fuel-air mixture during every cycle. While loud and inefficient, the pulse jet had the advantage of being extremely cheap and easy to build, perfect for disposable unmanned aircraft. At first, Guslau and Lusser proposed a remote-controlled target drone for training anti-aircraft gunners, but this eventually changed to an autonomous cruise missile armed with a high-explosive warhead. With its regular manned bomber force severely depleted, the German Luftwaffe was desperate for a new means of attacking the British Isles, and so on June 19, 1942, the Flying Bomb project was approved. Production of the engine was awarded to Argus, the fuselage to the Fieseler Aircraft Company, and the guidance system to the Askania Company. Though designated in-house as the Fieseler Fi-103, to conceal its true purpose from the Allies, the weapon was officially dubbed the Flakzielgerät 76, or anti-aircraft aiming device. Throughout its service, it was also known by various codenames such as Kirstein or Cherry Pit and Maikäfer or May Bug. But it was Hans Schwarz van Berkel, a journalist for the Nazi newspaper Das Reich, who would bestow the missile with its most infamous name, Vergeltungswaffe 1, or Vengeance Weapon 1. The finalized V1 design measured 7.5 meters long with a wingspan of 5 meters, the fuselage being built out of heavy rolled sheet steel and the detachable wings from plywood. Its Argus 109014 pulse jet engine, producing 3.5 kilonewtons of thrust, was mounted on top of the fuselage and gave the V1 a maximum speed of around 400 miles per hour or 640 kilometers an hour, faster than most contemporary propeller-driven fighter aircraft. The engine ran off regular 80-octane aviation gasoline fed from a 640-liter tank in the fuselage, which was pressurized using a spherical tank of compressed nitrogen. The aircraft had no ailerons, while the rudder and elevators were operated by pneumatic servos controlled by a simple autopilot. This consisted of 2 gyroscopes to control pitch and yaw, a magnetic compass to maintain heading, and an atmospheric pressure sensor to maintain altitude. The range of the weapon was controlled by a simple wind vane device in the nose connected to an odometer, which was set just before launch. After a predetermined number of revolutions, the odometer fired a set of explosive bolts that jammed the elevators downward, sending the missile into a crash dive. As you might expect, this system was highly inaccurate, being easily thrown off by winds aloft, but was accurate enough for use against city-sized targets like London. Also of note, the sudden dive also had the unintended effect of making the fuel slosh to the front of the tank, causing the engine to cut out. Citizens of target cities quickly learned to use this sudden cut-off to their advantage, as it meant they had between 5 and 15 seconds to take cover before the missile impacted the ground and detonated its 850-kilogram high-explosive warhead. Development of the V1 took place at Peenemünde, the Luftwaffe's top-secret research center on the Baltic coast. Here, on Christmas Eve 1942, the first prototype missile was successfully launched from the island of Usedom. The Argus 109 pulse jet did not produce enough thrust for the V1 to take off under its own power, so the missile had to be launched using a steam-powered catapult similar to that used on modern aircraft carriers. This consisted of a 49-meter-long inclined ramp with a slotted tube running along its length into which a dumbbell-shaped piston was inserted. A small lug protruded from the top of the piston through the slot in the tube, which was connected to the bottom of the missile. The catapult was then connected to a steam generator, which reacted concentrated hydrogen peroxide with potassium permanganate to create a hot, high-pressure mixture of steam and oxygen. This propelled the V1 from 0 to 320 kilometers an hour in around 1 second, after which the missile's own engine took over. Yet despite this early start, development of the V1 dragged on for more than a year, with dozens of missiles being test-launched before the design was perfected. Many of these teething problems were due to poor manufacturing quality, a consequence of German industry crumbling under constant Allied bombardment. Full-scale production of the missile did not begin until April 1944, with the first batch of 1,000 being manufactured at the Volkswagen plant in Fahrlersleben near Hamburg. Meanwhile, the new unit was formed under the command of Luftwaffe Oberst Max Wachtel to launch the missiles. As with the V1 itself, the unit was officially designated Flak Regiment 155 to disguise its true purpose from the Allies. The regiment arrived in the Pas-de-Calais region of France in early June 1944, but did not receive the equipment needed to launch its missiles until the 12th, nearly a week after Allied forces successfully landed in Normandy. This delay was caused not only by material and logistics shortages, but also by political infighting over the nature of the V1 launch sites. Adolf Hitler, obsessed with monumental fortifications, insisted that the missiles be launched from large, heavily fortified concrete emplacements. Many of his generals, however, saw such installations as too vulnerable to Allied air attack and argued for smaller mobile launch sites. Luftwaffe Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring struck a compromise, offering 4 fixed and 96 mobile sites. In the end, the generals were proven correct, as Allied aerial reconnaissance photographs immediately revealed the existence of the fixed V1 sites, easily recognizable from their launch ramps and trio of strange J-shaped buildings. These structures, used to store the missiles prior to launch, resembled skis turned on their side, and so the launch installations became known as ski sites. At first, the nature of these sites was a mystery, but when it was realized that all the ramps were aimed directly at London, their purpose became chillingly clear. Earlier in the summer of 1943, a British aerial photo interpreter named Constance Babington Smith spotted similar launch patterns at Peenemünde Test Centre, as well as a small cruciform object 7 meters wide, which she correctly interpreted as a flying bomb. In order to halt development of this and other German rocket weapons, in August 1943, the Allies launched Operation Crossbow. The opening act of Crossbow, Operation Hydra, was a night bombing raid against the Peenemünde facility, conducted on the night of the 17th and 18th of August. The raid was largely successful, killing many German scientists and disrupting weapons research for 2 months. However, many of the bombs also fell on the nearby Trassenheit concentration camp, killing many forced laborers. In any event, once ski sites began appearing in France in early 1944, both the Royal Air Force and US 8th Air Force launched a concerted bombing campaign to destroy them. However, this simply forced the Germans to abandon the fixed launch sites and switch to simpler modified sites which used prefabricated metal launch ramps and were easier to camouflage in forests or structures like factories and farmyards. By the early morning of June 13, 1944, the Germans were finally ready to unleash their new secret weapon on the British capital. But the opening salvo would be a modest one, for of the 100 launch sites offered, 65 had been completed, while only 10 had sufficient supplies and spare parts to become operational. Nonetheless, Oberst Wachtel proceeded with Operation Eisbär or Polar Bear, the campaign of German revenge for the D-Day landings. The launch sequence for the V1 began with the missile being wheeled out of its J-shaped hangar, whereupon its wooden wings were attached, its fuel tank filled, its nitrogen spheres pressurized, and its range vanes set. The missile was then wheeled into a square building built entirely without metal or any other magnetic materials. You see, one of the major problems which had plagued the V1's development was its sheet metal skin throwing off the magnetic compass. This was overcome inside the metal-free hangar by beating the missile's skin with wooden mallets, forcing the fuselage's magnetic field to align with the direction of the launch ramp. The missile was then mounted on the launch ramp and connected to the steam generator and launch controls, whereupon the launch crew fled to the safety of a control bunker or a slit trench. Compressed air was used to start the pulse engine, the gyroscopes were spun up, and the steam generator activated, launching the missile up the ramp. The first V1 was launched at 3:30 a.m. on the 13th of June 1944, quickly followed by 9 more. Of these, 4 crashed shortly after takeoff, 2 plunged into the English Channel, 3 came down on fields in Kent and Surrey, and 1 reached London, coming down in Bethnal Green. But the pace of the attack quickly accelerated. By the end of the following day, 393 V1s had been launched. By June 18th, that number had risen to 500. While many of the bombs failed to reach their targets, when one did, the effects were devastating. The blast from the giant warhead could pulverize brick and concrete, while the momentary vacuum left in its wake created a double whammy effect that could be just as destructive as the initial explosion. On one occasion, the heavy wooden doors of a firehouse were slammed shut by the blast, only to be wrenched back open by the vacuum. Londoners soon came to dread the ominous buzzing sound of the Doodlebug and the cold robotic way it ploughed towards its target, which British author Evelyn Waugh described as impersonal as a plague, as though the city were infested with enormous venomous insects. To counter this terrifying new threat, the British launched Operation Diver, sending 23,000 personnel and thousands of anti-aircraft guns and barrage balloons to the coasts of Kent, where they could intercept V1s launched from the Pas-de-Calais. As luck would have it, British gunners were able to take advantage of a powerful new weapon just then coming into service: the proximity fuse. Essentially a miniaturized radar set mounted in the nose of a shell, the proximity fuse detonated the shell when it came within a certain distance of its target, turning what were previously near misses into kills. The Coastal guns also enjoyed the advantage of a no-fly zone established within their field of fire, allowing them to shoot at anything that moved, and the use of the new American SCR-584 gun-laying radar. This gun screen proved remarkably effective, shooting down 50% of all V1s launched in the first week of the campaign. By the last week of August, their success rate had risen to 84%. The task of destroying those V1s that managed to get through the artillery screen fell to 8 fighter squadrons stationed around London. These squadrons were equipped with the powerful Hawker Tempest 5 and Supermarine Spitfire Mark 9 and Mark 14 fighters, which were just fast enough to catch the speedy doodlebugs. Even so, actually shooting the flying bombs down proved to be more challenging than expected. Not only were they small and hard to hit, but their thick sheet metal bodies deflected the standard .303 caliber bullets used in British aircraft machine guns. 20mm cannons had more penetrating power but a lower velocity, forcing pilots to attack from shorter ranges and exposing them to extreme danger if the bomb's warhead detonated. Wing Commander Roland Beaumont recalled, "For the first few days, it was rather interesting because none of us knew exactly what was going to happen. They were bombs after all, and they were expected to blow up. We first of all started opening fire on them from about 400 yards for safety from astern. They were a tiny target, and we used to miss them rather consistently, and so we halved the range to 200 yards. When you fired at that range and the thing exploded in front of you, you were traveling at 400 miles per hour or more, and you'd have no time to avoid the explosion. And as soon as you saw it, you were in it, and you'd go through the center of the fireball and come out the other side, and always come out upside down. It was some time before we could figure this one out, but you were in fact going through a partial vacuum as you went through the center of the explosion. In a partial vacuum, the torque of this enormous propeller has the effect of twisting the aeroplane over. It was rather extraordinary. The only adverse effects were fire damage to the outside of the aeroplane. The rudder and elevator of the Tempest were fabric covered, and quite often this used to burn." Other pilots were not so lucky, with 5 being killed in V1 explosions. This included free French pilot Jean Marador, who died on August 3, 1944, while trying to stop a V1 from landing on a military hospital in Kent. The extreme risks posed by shooting at V1s prompted Wing Commander Beaumont to develop a bold new method for defeating the doodlebug. To quote, "I had used up my ammunition on one V1 and saw another and decided to do something about it. The idea was to get my wingtip close under the wingtip of the V1 but not touching it, and then gradually raising my right wing, causing the airflow over it to make the V1 bank. This affected the gyro stabilization of the missile, causing it to go out of control, toppling over and crashing. Wingtipping would not be the only clever means of defeating the V1, as we'll get into shortly, but it nonetheless soon became the standard method for taking them down, though it was not without its own risks. The Spitfire and Tempest, being optimized for lightness and speed, were built of a relatively delicate aluminium alloy, meaning many an aircraft returned to base with severely damaged wings following a wrestling match with the much more robust V1. Another valuable weapon, which had just come into service, was the Gloucester Meteor, Britain's first jet-powered fighter. With a top speed of 600 miles per hour, the Meteor was more than a match for the V1, though its 20mm cannons had an unfortunate habit of jamming. On August 4, 1944, Flying Officer T.D. Dixie Dean of No. 616 Squadron used wingtipping to bring down a V1 over Tunbridge Wells, scoring the first ever combat victory for an Allied jet aircraft. By war's end, No. 616 Squadron would shoot down a total of 13 V1s. The most prolific V1 ace, however, was Tempest pilot squadron leader Joseph Berry of No. 501 Squadron, credited with 59.5 victories. He was followed in the rankings by Dutch Spitfire pilots, Flying Officer R.F. Bergwall and Flight Lieutenant J.L. Plessman with 21 and 12 victories respectively. The efficiency of Operation Diver steadily increased until, by late August 1944, hardly any V1s were getting through the defensive screen. For example, of the 94 bombs launched on August 28th, 65 were brought down by guns, 33 by fighter aircraft, and 2 by the belt of barrage balloons encircling London. The Allied forces also continued their crossbow bombing campaign against V1 launch sites and storage depots, greatly reducing the number that could be fired. But of the 3,531 V1s that actually reached the English coast, the vast majority were defeated not by guns or aircraft, but by clever counterintelligence. Though some V1s were fitted with radio transmitters so their flights could be tracked, the Germans relied more on secret agents to report where the bombs fell. What the Germans didn't know, however, was that nearly all of their agents in the British Isles had been captured and turned in a massive counterintelligence operation called Double Cross. Using Double Cross agents, British intelligence was able to convince the Germans that most of their V1s were overshooting their targets. This in turn led the Germans to set their ranges too short, causing many V1s to dive harmlessly into the English Channel. But what ultimately defeated the V1 were the advancing Allied ground forces on the continent, who in September 1944 overran the launch sites in France and brought the main bombardment campaign to an end. Undeterred, the Germans switched to launching V-1s from beneath the wings of Heinkel HE-111s and HE-117 bombers. Around 1,200 of these bombs were launched against Portsmouth and Southampton, and 50 against Manchester, but due to stability problems, few actually reached their targets. But as the strength of the Luftwaffe gradually dwindled and more airfields were overrun, the V-1 campaign quickly tapered off, with the last bomb to reach England being shot down over Suffolk on March 29, 1945, barely a week before Nazi Germany surrendered. By this time, however, England had come under attack by an even more advanced weapon, the V-2 ballistic missile. Fueled by alcohol and liquid oxygen, the V-2 climbed up to the edge of space before plunging down on its target at twice the speed of sound, making it impossible to hear or see coming or to shoot it down. Development of the V-2 actually began long before the V-1, but due to its greater complexity, it was not operational until September 1944, around the same time the main V-1 campaign came to an end. That said, between September 7th, 1944 and March 27th, 1945, 3,172 V-2s were launched against targets in southern England, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. However, the V-2 was even more inaccurate than the V-1, a flaw made worse by misinformation on missile impact spread by the double-cross system, and it was even less reliable. Also, its silent supersonic approach ironically made it less effective as a weapon of terror, lacking the dread factor of the V-1's distinctive droning sound. But arguably the V-2's greatest flaw was its unjustifiably astronomical cost. Each V-1 cost around 5,000 Reichsmarks, equivalent to about $500. Of the 10,500 V-1s launched over the course of the war, 3,531 reached their targets, killing 6,000, wounding 40,000, and causing around $150 million in property damage. This comes out to 0.008 casualties and $28 of damage for every dollar spent on the weapon. Each V-2, by contrast, cost a whopping 100,000 Reichsmarks, or $17,000, the same as a top-of-the-line fighter aircraft, not counting development costs. Yet the 3,172 V-2s launched during the war only killed around 5,000 people and wounded 6,500, a casualty-to-cost ratio nearly 40 times smaller. The human cost of its creation was also atrocious. Around 20,000 concentration camp inmates died in horrific underground factories producing Hitler's second vengeance weapon, making the V-2 the only weapon in history to kill more people in its manufacture than in combat. Indeed, the V-2 program diverted so many vital resources from the German war effort that the American theoretical physicist Freeman Dyson once remarked, "Those of us who were seriously engaged in the war were very grateful to Werner von Braun, the director of the V-2 program. We knew that each V-2 cost as much to produce as a high-performance fighter airplane. We knew that German forces on the fighting fronts were in desperate need of airplanes, and that the V-2 rockets were doing us no military damage. From our point of view, the V-2 program was almost as good as if Hitler had adopted a policy of unilateral disarmament."
The mysterious Kugelpanzer, the German-designed one-man spherical tank. During World War II, German engineers designed and built a number of revolutionary super or wonder weapons known in German as Wunderwaffe. This included a wide array of aircraft, guns, and ships. Among these weapons is a mysterious small round tank named the Kugelpanzer, which literally means spherical tank. The odd little tank was never seen in the European theatre, and very little is definitively known about its purpose. What is known is that it was made in Germany and then shipped to Japan, and then later captured by the Soviets in 1945, probably in Manchuria. Today, the only one known to exist can be found in the Kubinka Tank Museum in the Odintsovsky district of Moscow, Russia. Powered by a single-cylinder, two-stroke engine, the Kugelpanzer has a slit in the front, presumably a driver's viewing port, and a small arm and a wheel in the rear, perhaps for stability and/or maneuvering. Its hull is only 5 mm, that's 0.2 inches thick, and it isn't fully clear what type of metal comprises its armor. And if you're wondering why we don't know this, well, that's simply because no one is allowed to take a sample of it. Popular hypotheses concerning its purpose include reconnaissance, as a mobile observation post for managing artillery fire, and as a cable-laying vehicle. However, there is actually very little evidence to support any of these hypotheses, since there has never been any documentation found that explains the vehicle or its design. Given the dearth of evidence, as you would expect, speculation is rampant, and one intriguing theory even posits that it was commissioned by the Japanese as part of their kamikaze strategy of suicide missions. By August of 1944, the ailing Japanese military had been at war in the Pacific for 7 long years, beginning with the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937. During this period, rather than being captured and wanting to get in one last lick, some Japanese pilots had begun the practice of crashing their mostly disabled planes into enemy positions and killing themselves in the process. Through most of the Pacific War, this was an informal, voluntary act. However, as the war was winding down, the desperate Japanese command, who were running out of qualified pilots and whose aircraft at this point in the war were outdated, decided that they would get the most out of their unskilled personnel and obsolete machinery by incorporating planned suicide missions into their battle strategies. As such, in the fall of 1944, Japanese forces began a series of kamikaze strikes. If you want to learn more about how this went down, do see our video on how were kamikaze pilots chosen. Now, in addition to improvised devices such as simply strapping bombs onto existing aircraft, the Japanese military began manufacturing specialized equipment. These included the aircraft called Oka or Cherry Blossom, as well as suicide boats such as the Shinyo Seaquake. Indeed, even tiny submarines were made, including a modified torpedo named Kaiten, returning to heaven, and Kairu, which meant Sea Dragon, which was a two-manned craft. Given this mindset of many Japanese leaders, it has been hypothesized by some that the Kugelpanzer was a part of this plan, with a few key points often put forth to support this theory. First, like all the other suicide missions, it was small and designed to be operated with a limited 1 to 2 man crew. Second, it wasn't equipped with any apparent offensive weaponry, although it has been speculated that it was meant to have a machine gun mounted in the front. And third, its hull was a rather flimsy 5mm thick, which was very thin compared to other armored vehicles, but on par with that of a suicide craft. For example, the Type 97 Shiha, said to be the most widely produced Japanese medium tank of World War II, had 26mm thick armor on the sides of the turret and 33mm thick armor on its gun shield. On the other hand, the Long Lance torpedo, from which the Kaiten manned torpedoes was developed, had a comparably thin shell at 3.2mm thick, much closer to the width of the Kugelpanzer outer housing. For reference, the thickness of a common World War II helmet, the M1, was at 0.035 to 0.037 inches, just under 1mm thick, which was sufficient to sometimes stop a .45 caliber bullet. So essentially, the 5mm thick walls of the tank would have been sturdy enough to relatively reliably stop many types of enemy bullets from getting in, but thin enough to easily give way to a blast from within. But this is all just hypothesizing. Whatever its intended use, the Kugelpanzer certainly has gone down as one of the most unique weapons developed during World War II. And let's get into those bonus facts. The aforementioned Japanese one-manned torpedo-like submarines called Kaitens were just modified torpedoes that allowed the person inside to control them. They also featured a self-destruct mechanism if the person failed in their mission. This was necessary as there was no way for the person inside to get out of the torpedo once he was sealed in. Early models did include a mechanism to escape once the torpedo was aimed correctly, but supposedly not a single soldier seems to have ever used this feature, or so the official story goes. Because of their apparent lack of desire to escape, this feature was quickly abandoned. Each person who died as a Kaiten pilot would earn their family about 10,000 yen, which is about $120 today. Kaitens were ultimately not very successful, primarily because they could not be deployed very deeply and were stored on the outside of the submarines. This isn't so much a problem for the Kaitens as it was for the submarines that were carrying them, who would have to stay very near the surface. This resulted in an average of about 8 submarines carrying Kaitens being destroyed for every 2 ships destroyed by the Kaitens. Each Kaiten was about 50 feet long, could reach a speed of 30 miles an hour, and contained a warhead at the nose. Video today, the flying tank. When it comes to war, innovation is key, and World War II saw more insane ideas and weapons of war developed than perhaps any war before it. One of the more surreal was the Anatov A-40, colloquially known as the flying tank. Known in Russia as something that translates to winged tank, the Anatov A-40 was the end result of one Oleg Anatov. He was wondering how Russians could get a fully laden tank onto a battlefield without exposing a plane to enemy fire from the ground. Previous to this, they had already experimented with strapping T-37 light tanks and T-27 tankettes to bombers as a means of transporting them as early as 1935. However, both tanks were simply too small to do much damage in combat and risked an entire TB-3 bomber to put one of these tanks into battle, and it simply wasn't worth it. The Russians also experimented with simply dropping tanks, with and without parachutes, out of planes to see what would happen. As you might have guessed, that didn't exactly work out. In these cases, the crews were going to parachute down from the tank separately and then hopefully get to the tank before enemy troops were able to. As you might have guessed from this strategy, a better plan was needed. In 1940, Oleg sketched a design for a set of glider wings that could be outfitted onto a much larger tank, enabling it to fly if towed behind an aircraft that could get up to speed. Now, on paper, this was a pretty genius idea, since it solved the problem of exposing the transporting aircraft to enemy ground fire, as well as the weight limit of the TB3 that had restricted what it could transport to very small tanks. However, it would take another 2 years and a German invasion before anyone asked Oleg to actually build and test his design. Once he did, he attached a pair of custom-built wings to a modified T-60 tank. After that tank glided down to the battlefield, the wings were designed to be ejected upon landing. If you're wondering how the tank's pilot steered the thing, that too was a work of simplistic genius. Its wings were controlled by the movement of the tank's own turret. Moving it up and down, for example, would adjust the pitch, and moving it from left to right would allow it to bank left or right. While this might sound good in theory, because of the extreme weight of the tank and the limited lift the wings could actually provide, armaments, fuel, and even armor needed to be removed from the T-60 to get it into the air for a test flight. That said, according to the Russians, the A-40 had a successful test flight, though successful might have been a bit of an overstatement. During the A-40's only flight in history, the pilot at the tank's helm was Sergei Anakin. Sergei was a test pilot by trade and had to take a crash course in tank driving prior to the actual flight. As for the flight itself, the Tupolev TB3 bomber towing the tank had its engines overheat, and they nearly failed almost immediately after takeoff. Because of this, the TB3 had to cut the tank free much earlier than expected. Even still, Sergei was able to glide the tank in and reportedly landed very smoothly in a nearby field. He was even able to drive the tank back to headquarters and report on the success personally. While he reported a smooth landing, it was a pretty tricky business. It required Sergei to start the tank's engines and engage the tracks before they hit the ground. Questioned about the experience after the fact, Sergei was apparently very excited about the ordeal, but was skeptical about how it would have turned out had the tank been fully loaded, as it would need to be in battle. With the TB3 struggling to pull the slimmed-down tank, and the fact that a good number of the TB3 planes needed to tow the contraption had been destroyed in the war, well, the project was ultimately scrapped. But that is not to say that some officials didn't see the benefit of flying tanks raining death from the sky. It was just agreed that it was a much better idea to use these bombers for more conventional purposes, like bombing things.
If you don't want to learn about people blowing up dogs, don't watch today's video. I'm Simon Whistler, you're watching the Today I Found Out YouTube channel, and in the video today, you're going to learn about the military applications of dogs that are a little bit less than humane. Let's get started with today's video.
Exploding dogs. During World War II, many innovative weapons were created and promptly put into action. One of the more unique and wildly inhumane were exploding anti-tank dogs. These dogs, usually Alsatians, were also called Hundminen, or dog mines. They were trained to carry explosives on their bodies to enemy tanks, where they would be detonated. No, it did not end well for the dogs in question. This type of animal weaponry was first used by the Soviets. Following a decision in 1924 to allow dogs to aid the military, a dog training school was set up in Moscow. The military recruited such people as police dog trainers, hunters, circus trainers, and animal scientists. 12 more schools were set up hot on the heels of the first one, and the Soviet Dog Training Division started out in earnest. At first, dogs were trained to carry supplies, tracking mines, and rescuing people, tasks at which the dogs excelled. In the early 1930s, they decided it would be a good idea to turn man's best friend into an anti-tank weapon. 3 of the schools began training dogs for this purpose. First, they were trained to carry a bomb to a tank and run off. Afterwards, their handler could detonate the bomb with a remote, or the bomb may have simply been set with a timer. There were several reasons why these methods didn't work. To drop the bomb, the dogs had to put on a belt with their teeth to release it. This proved to be too complicated, and often the dog would simply return to its handler without releasing the bomb. Second, remotes were too expensive at the time to be used practically, so timers would be used more often instead. If the dog returned to his handler with the bomb still attached, he would have killed the handler and himself. Even if the bomb was released under the tank, if the tank was in motion and the timing wasn't set just so, the bomb would simply explode without doing any damage to the enemy tank. The Soviets scrapped their initial plan, but unfortunately for Fido, they came up with a new one. Rather than drop a bomb, explosives would be strapped to the dog. When the dog ran under the tank, the bomb would be triggered, killing the dog and hopefully disabling the tank. As if ending their life wasn't enough, the training involved wasn't exactly a walk in the park. The dogs were starved, and then food was placed under a practice tank, training them to think that food was under all tanks. After a while, additional battle sounds were added to their practice runs so they wouldn't be spooked when they were running under the real thing. Anti-tank dogs started being used in earnest in 1941 when German forces advanced on Soviet lands. 30 dogs kicked off what would be a rather lackluster debut for the exploding dog force. Indeed, the dogs were so ineffective that the Soviet military was accused of simply sacrificing them. Part of the problem was that many of the dogs refused to dive under the tanks in the field. They were being shot at, which hadn't happened in training, and they were understandably not willing to dive under some huge noisy beast that was seemingly trying to kill them. Food can only motivate an animal so much. I could put a steak on my vacuum cleaner, and my dog wouldn't go near it, even if she hadn't eaten in ages. A tank with guns a-blazing is more noisy and frightening. When the dogs were shot and killed before they could get into position and blow up, they were taken by German soldiers who were able to examine the weaponry and potentially copy it themselves. They didn't end up taking advantage. Rather, one captured German soldier claimed that they found the entire system rather inefficient. Well, it was. One downside was that the Germans did take measures to defend themselves against the dogs, rendering their sacrifice often useless. A much larger problem was that the dogs had been trained with Soviet tanks, not German ones. Soviet and German tanks used different types of fuel, and some of the dogs sniffed out the fuel they were used to and trotted off to blow up the tanks used by the very military that had trained them. Whoops. That said, the anti-tank dogs are known to have taken out some tanks, including at the Battle of Kursk, in which 12 tanks were destroyed by 16 deployed dogs. This was possibly one of the most successful anti-tank dog ventures in history. The Soviets later reported that some 300 tanks total had been destroyed by anti-tank dogs, but many questioned this number, thinking it was probably made up by the Soviet government, who wanted to justify the program, particularly justify killing so many dogs with so few results. Whether they were useful or not, anti-tank dogs started to be used less and less from 1942 onwards, though there were still anti-tank dogs that continued to be trained until 1996. While the Soviets were perhaps the most prominent users of anti-tank dogs, they were trained in other countries too, including Japan and the United States. Much more recently, bombs were strapped to dogs as late as 2007, when insurgents attempted to use them during the last Iraq War. In this case, there's only one documented case of a bomb actually being detonated while attached to a dog, though. Protests rose up among Muslims who believed that animals should be killed, only for food. Bonus facts. Dogs were not the only weaponized animals. There were attempts to make bomb carriers out of cats, birds, and rats. Bombs have also been strapped to camels, horses, donkeys, and mules. Donkeys were especially favored in Iraq because they could carry packs stuffed with bombs without looking suspicious. Even monkeys, and supposedly whales, could not escape the military's explosive reach. Bonus fact 2. Dolphins trained to kill by the Soviet Union were sold to Iran in the 1990s when the Russian military closed its marine mammal program. The United States Navy still has such a program, though dolphins are supposedly not trained to kill, but rather to perform various other tasks.
An army marches on its stomach. This adage, variously ascribed to Frederick the Great or Napoleon Bonaparte, captured one of the universal truths of warfare. The battles are won not by men and weapons, but by logistics, the ability to efficiently and reliably supply said men and guns with ammunition, food, medicine, and any other resources required to sustain the fight. As armies became increasingly mechanized in the early 20th century, a new element became vital to the prosecution of war: the fuel needed to feed vast fleets of trucks, tanks, and aircraft. During the Second World War, the massive logistical problem of slaking armies' endless thirst for fuel led to the development of a deceptively simple but ingenious device that changed the course of history and remains in widespread use today. This is the story of the humble jerry can, the little metal can that won a war. Prior to the Second World War, the mechanized armies of the world used a variety of fuel containers largely adapted from civilian models, few of which were particularly suited to the rigors of combat. For example, the standard British Army fuel canister was the rectangular 18-litre petrol, oil and water, or POW container, derisively nicknamed the Flimsy. And flimsy it was, with thin sheet metal walls and folded and soldered seams that frequently split and leaked. Indeed, so fragile were Flimsies that they had to be transported in special wooden crates to prevent them from crushing each other. Inconveniently, the screw lids also required a wrench and a funnel to use. Early in the Second World War, the British quickly discovered the importance of fuel logistics as their armies faced off against the Germans in the deserts of Egypt and Libya. The poor design and construction of the flimsy caused up to 30% of British fuel bound for North Africa to be lost in transit, while leaking fuel containers caused the explosion and sinking of at least one transport ship in the Mediterranean. Such shortages severely hampered the British war effort. As historian Desmond Young later described, "No one who did not serve in the desert can realize to what extent the difference between complete and partial success rested on the simplest item of our equipment. And the worst. Whoever sent our troops into desert warfare with a 5-gallon petrol tin has much to answer for. The overall loss was almost incalculable." To calculate the tanks destroyed, the number of men who were killed or went into captivity because of shortage of petrol at some crucial moment, the ships and merchant seamen lost in carrying it, would be quite impossible. Indeed, these shortages were largely responsible for the failure of several British offensives, including the First Battle of El Alamein in July 1942. Meanwhile, the panzers of General Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps were able to maintain their breakneck advance thanks to an ingenious piece of German engineering, the Wehrmachten Einheitskanister, or Standard Army Can. Developed in great secrecy by engineer Vincenz Gunvogel of Müller Engineering and first issued in 1937, the can was specifically designed for the mechanized Blitzkrieg tactics that the German army would use to conquer most of Europe. The 20-litre can was constructed of thick stamped steel with recessed welded seams, making it resistant to splitting and leakage even when roughly handled, while cross-shaped indentations in the side walls allowed the body to expand and contract with temperature. The interior was lined with plastic, protecting the steel from corrosion and allowing the can to safely carry water as well as fuel. The triple handles at the top allowed the can to be carried by 1 or 2 men or to be passed from man to man, bucket brigade style, and even more ingeniously, the handles were hollow, allowing just enough air to allow the can to float even when filled with fuel. Finally, the opening featured an integrated spout and air tube to allow for smooth and efficient pouring, and most importantly, could be opened and closed without the use of tools. Hundreds of thousands of these cans were manufactured for the German armed forces, and it wasn't long before examples of this ingenious device were captured by the British in Norway and North Africa. Immediately recognizing the superiority of the German design over the troublesome flimsy, the British began capturing as many from the enemy as they could and eventually began producing their own copies, which, due to their Germany origin, soon became known as jerry cans. Meanwhile, the much maligned flimsy was relegated to a variety of secondary roles. For example, cutting a flimsy in half and filling it with gasoline-soaked sand produced a handy makeshift stove dubbed the Benghazi burner or Benghazi boiler. Similarly, devices were also used as improvised flare pots for marking desert airstrips at night. Flimsies were also filled with sand and rocks and used in place of sandbags for fortifying trenches and foxholes. By contrast, the United States was slow to recognize the virtues of the jerry can, despite first learning of the design before the British. In 1939, Paul Pleiss, an American engineer working for the German autobody firm Pleiss Amberbud Presswork, or ABP, decided to embark on an epic road trip from Germany to India. Just prior to departure, however, Pleiss realized that he had forgotten to pack containers for emergency water. But as luck would have it, Pleiss's traveling companion, a fellow ABP engineer whose name has been lost to history, knew of a supply of fuel canisters belonging to the Luftwaffe being stored at Berlin's Tempelhof Airport. He managed to steal 3 of the newfangled cans and strap them to the bottom of the car, whereupon he and Pleiss set off on their journey. The pair made it across 11 national borders before Hermann Goering, head of the Luftwaffe, learned of the engineer's departure and dispatched an aircraft to bring him home. Pleiss continued his journey alone, but by the time he reached Calcutta, the Second World War had broken out, making a return trip impossible. Pleiss thus placed his vehicle in storage and made his way back to Philadelphia by ship. Upon arriving back in America, Pleiss contacted the US Army and informed them of the marvelous German fuel can which had served him so well on his journey. Realizing that removing and shipping the can separately from India would attract suspicion, Pleiss instead arranged to have the whole car shipped instead. It arrived in the summer of 1940 and the cans were sent to Camp Holabird in Maryland for evaluation. But while Army inspectors were impressed, their redesign of the German can was a poor facsimile. Its seams were rolled instead of welded, it had no plastic lining, and the spout still required a wrench and funnel to use. Nonetheless, to Pleiss's dismay, the ersatz jerry can soon went into full-scale production. The situation began to change in September 1942 when Richard M. Daniel, a quality control officer posted to American oil refineries in the Middle East, learned from British officers that the only kind of fuel can worth having was the German jerry can. In response, Daniel submitted a report to Washington which convinced the government to halt production of the old 10-gallon fuel can and a newly designed but still inferior Navy can in favor of a direct copy of the jerry can. With the United States' conversion to the jerry can, production was ramped up and nearly 2 million were sent to North Africa in 1943, playing a pivotal role in the eventual defeat of the Axis forces in the region. And as the Allied forces advanced across Western Europe in the wake of the 1944 D-Day landings, the jerry can advanced right along with them. To give an idea of the pivotal role this seemingly simple device played in the European campaign, by October 1944, the Allies were moving more than 1 million gallons of gasoline a day, most of it in jerry cans. Yet despite nearly 19 million jerry cans being produced by the end of the war, lack of discipline in returning the empties led to severe shortages across Europe, with soldiers using them for all sorts of unauthorized purposes, such as shoring up gun positions or creating footpaths across muddy roads. Indeed, the situation got so bad that the US Army even resorted to offering prizes to French schoolchildren to bring back as many emptied jerry cans as possible. Nonetheless, the humble jerry cans soldiered on with distinction to the end of the war, leading US President Franklin D. Roosevelt to declare, "Without these cans, it would have been impossible for our armies to cut their way across France at a lightning pace which exceeded the German Blitz of 1940. But perhaps the greatest testament to the jerry can's ingenuity and versatility is the fact that it remains in use in both military and civilian applications, its design all but unchanged after 80 years, except for the replacement of metal with modern plastics. Winston Churchill called her the Beast. 251 meters long and displacing 53,000 tons, she could cruise at 30 knots and engage targets up to 35 kilometers away with massive 1-ton shells using her 8 38-centimeter guns. She was the Tirpitz, the largest and most powerful German battleship of the Second World War. Throughout the conflict, the deadly threat Tirpitz posed to Arctic convoys hung over the Allies' heads like the sword of Damocles, and every available resource was dedicated to putting her out of action. But she proved a tough nut to crack, with attempt after attempt to attack Tirpitz from the air, ending in failure. Then in September 1943, one of the largest naval vessels of the war finally met her match in one of the smallest, a tiny 4-man craft barely 15 meters long. This is the story of the X-Craft, Britain's surprisingly effective World War II midget submarine. During the Second World War, several nations experimented with miniature submarines as a means of infiltrating enemy naval bases. Among the first to use this technology in combat was the Italian Regia Marina, whose elite Decima Flotiglia MAS Frogman unit deployed a unique vehicle known as the SLC, or Silurio Lente Corsa, Italian for low-speed torpedo. Nicknamed Maiale or Pig by its crews, the SLC was essentially an electrically powered torpedo piloted by 2 drivers sitting astride the hull. The Maiale and its crew were carried close to the target harbour by larger conventional submarines and launched from special cradles on the deck, whereupon the crew would dive, cut through enemy anti-submarine nets, and enter the harbour. Once beneath the target vessel, the crew would detach the Maiale's explosive warhead, suspend it from the vehicle's keel using clamps, set the delay fuse, and return to the submarine mothership. On December the 19th, 1941, Maiale succeeded in infiltrating the British anchorage at Alexandria, Egypt, and seriously damaging the battleships HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Valiant. This feat inspired the British to develop their own copy of the Maiale, which they dubbed the Chariot. The first operational deployment of the Chariot was Operation Title, an attempt to attack the Tirpitz at its anchorage in Trondheimsfjord in Norway. Between October 1940 and April 1942, the Royal Air Force and Royal Navy had launched no fewer than 11 air raids against the German battleship to no avail, and it was decided to try a different approach. On October the 26th, 1942, the fishing trawler Arthur, manned by 3 Norwegian resistance members, sailed from Britain with 2 chariots secured under her hull and 7 Royal Navy frogmen hidden in her hull. After crossing the North Sea and bluffing their way past German patrols, on October the 30th, the raiders reached the mouth of Trondheimsfjord, where the chariots were detached from their mountings and placed under tow. The following day, however, a violent storm caused the chariots to break loose from their tow cables, forcing the mission to be scrubbed. The raiders scuttled the Arthur and made their way on foot towards neutral Sweden. While 9 of the 10 made it across the border and were later repatriated to Britain, the 10th was captured by the Germans and shot as a spy. For the next attack on the Tirpitz, the Royal Navy decided to use a more sophisticated weapon, the newly developed X-class submarine. The idea for this craft had been proposed early in the war by Admiral Sir Max Horton, but it was not until the Tirpitz appeared in Norwegian waters that any priority was assigned to its development. Unlike the Chariot, the X-class, more commonly known as the X-craft, was a fully functional enclosed submarine, albeit one barely 15 meters long. The craft was powered by a 4-cylinder, 42 horsepower Gardner diesel engine of the same type used on London double-decker buses, which gave the submarine a surface speed of 6.5 knots. For underwater maneuvering, a 30 horsepower electric motor was used, giving a submerged speed of 2 knots. The X-craft was typically manned by a crew of 3, a commander, a pilot, and an engineer, though a diver was later added who could exit the craft through a wet-dry lockout compartment to cut through anti-torpedo nets and other obstacles. Navigation was by periscope and dead reckoning, while passive sonar and a system of electromagnets were fitted to allow the craft to evade German patrol vessels and magnetic anti-submarine sensors. Instead of torpedoes, the X-craft was armed with 2 side cargoes, each filled with 2 tons of Amatol explosives. These were to be dropped under the keel of the target vessel and detonated by a time fuse. As the range of the X-craft was only 1,000 kilometers surfaced and 150 kilometers submerged, they were towed to their targets by a conventional submarine with a passage crew aboard. Once near the target, the operational crew was transferred to the X-craft using rubber dinghies. This system allowed the operational crew to get as much rest as possible before a mission. Following developmental trials of the first 4 prototypes in 1942, the Admiralty ordered the construction of 6 X-craft for operational use, designated X5 to X10. As Vickers Engineering, Britain's foremost submarine builder, was overwhelmed with orders for conventional submarines, X-craft production was contracted out to 3 smaller engineering firms: Markham's in Chesterfield, Broadbent's in Huddersfield, and Marshall's in Gainsborough. To man the craft, the Admiralty put out a request for fit, unmarried sailors who were strong swimmers. The Midget submarines and their crews were organised as the 12th Submarine Flotilla, based at HMS Varble, the former Carr's Hydropathic Hotel at Port Bannatyne on Scotland's Isle of Bute. The submarine depot ships HMS Bonadventure and HMS Titania served as tenders, while the obsolete battleship HMS Malaya served as a training target. Operating these newfangled weapons proved a grueling affair. The cabin of the X-craft was only 2.4 meters long, 1.5 meters wide, and 1.7 meters tall, with barely enough room for the crew to stand up or sit down in. And while canisters of soda lime were provided to absorb carbon dioxide, the heat and fumes leaking from the diesel engine soon made the cabin unbearably hot and stuffy. As Jeff Galway, a member of the Combined Operations pilotage parties who underwent X-craft training, later recalled, there were 2 bunks in an X-craft, one in the control room for the captain when he was not at the periscope, and another for the engineer alongside the engine. There was also room for 2 to lie down on top of the batteries in the fore ends. One entered the battery compartment through watertight doors opening into the control room and 4 ends. There were 2 seats in the control room, one by the control panel where the hydroplanes and trim and bilge pumps were controlled, the other by the steering wheel. The warmth of the diesel was the only means of drying clothes down below. Heavy sweaters or vests and long johns were what the crew wore under their navy battle dress or diving suits, and one had to take great care to keep them out of the air intake or the diesel in case they choked it and stopped the engine. There were also more unexpected hardships, as Galway also describes. The wet and dry lockout was a repulsive place, as we had of course to use it as an escape hatch on the diver's routine exit and entry when the X-craft was submerged. Lockout contained the head, toilet, a baby Blake WC of the kind most yachtsmen knew quite well. On leaving the submerged X-craft, the diver or COPP swimmer flooded the inner cylinder, the water flowing through the WC bowl and discharge tank of the head. The swimmer or diver operated the wet-dry lockout system by sitting on the WC pan. A few old friends and used sheets of paper floated up round him in his specially designed Steve Gorman diving suit before he operated the pressure equalizing valve and climbed out. I found the business of using the head in the X-craft so disgusting that I worked out a technique of crouching on the casing à la française, hanging on to the ensign's staff. Some found this too acrobatic, and some chaps never opened their bowels during their time at sea in an X-craft, a most unhealthy state of affairs if an exercise or operation involved living aboard for several days. In addition to the difficulties inherent to operating the submarines themselves, the men of the 12th Flotilla faced a punishing training regimen, which included extensive practice in cutting anti-torpedo nets and placing explosive charges, escape and evasion training in the case the crews had to scuttle their vessels, and even being depth charged to acclimatize them to this experience. By the summer of 1943, however, the crews were deemed ready for action, and the Admiralty began planning a new operation against the Tirpitz, codenamed Operation Source. By this time, the Tirpitz had been moved to Kavjord in northern Norway. The operation was thus scheduled for late September, when the coming Arctic winter would provide many hours of darkness, but before winter storms made the seas too rough. All 6 operational X-craft were assigned to the operation. X5, commanded by Lieutenant Henty Creer, X6, commanded by Lieutenant Donald Cameron, X7, commanded by Lieutenant Basil Place, X8, commanded by Sub-Lieutenant Brian McFarlane, X9, commanded by Lieutenant Edward Kieran, and X10, commanded by Lieutenant Ken Hudspeth. X5, X6, and X7 were assigned to attack the Tirpitz in Kavjord, and X9 and X10 were assigned to attack the battleship Scharnhorst, while X8 was assigned to attack the heavy cruiser Lutzow in nearby Langford. The attack force departed Scotland on September the 11th, towed by the conventional submarines HMS Truculent, Certis, Sea Nymph Thrasher, Stubborn, and Scepter. Almost immediately, disaster struck as the X9's tow cable snapped and the submarine was lost with all hands. The craft had likely been trimmed bow heavy to compensate for the towing, causing her to plunge into an uncontrollable dive. At the same time, X8 developed serious leaks in her explosive cargoes, which it was forced to jettison. Unfortunately, the cargoes immediately detonated, damaging X8 so badly that she had to be scuttled. The remaining 4 submarines reached the mouth of Kafjord on September the 20th. The operational crews transferred over to the X-craft and began their run on the target. Unfortunately, X-10 was plagued by mechanical problems and was unable to reach the target submarine. However, her commander, Lieutenant Hudspeth, was able to regain the open sea and rendezvous with his tow submarine. However, the Midget sub was later lost when its tow cable snapped en route to Scotland. In any case, the X-10's target, Scharnhorst, was not in her anchorage, being out on training maneuvers at the time. The remaining 3 X-crafts succeeded in penetrating the anchorage and began their attacks at 7 p.m. on September the 22nd. X-5 was spotted and fired upon as she approached our Tirpitz' starboard bow and was lost with all hands. However, as her wreck has never been located, her exact fate remains a mystery. Next to approach was X6, although she was soon stopped by an anti-torpedo net and her periscope stopped working. Taking a gamble, Lieutenant Cameron decided to surface and follow a small vessel through a gap in the net. While X6 was spotted by German lookouts, she was mistaken for a porpoise and not fired upon. X6 and X7 ultimately succeeded in laying their charges under Tirpitz, but were spotted while trying to escape, forcing their crews to bail out and scuttle the craft. The 6 submarines were immediately captured and brought aboard Tirpitz, where they informed their captors that a massive explosion would go off within the hour. But before Tirpitz's crew attempted to move the ship out of the way, the 4 side cargoes detonated. The explosions inflicted severe damage, buckling a part of Tirpitz's hull, rupturing a fuel tank, destroying several turbo generators, knocking one turret off its mountains, and flooding the ship with 1,400 tons of water. For this action, Lieutenants Donald Cameron and Basil Place of the X6 and S7 received the Victoria Cross, the United Kingdom's highest award for gallantry, while 4 other crew members were awarded the Distinguished Service Cross and Conspicuous Gallantry medals. Though Operation Source failed to sink the battleship, it put her out of action for a full 7 months, neutralizing a major threat to the Arctic convoys. Finally, on November 12, 1944, 29 Avro Lancaster bombers of the RAF's No. 9 and No. 617 squadrons succeeded in destroying the Tirpitz in Tromsford using 5-ton armor-piercing tallboy bombs. In early 1944, the X-craft lost in Operation Source was replaced by 6 new models designated X-20 to X-25. The next mission for the 12th Flotilla was a simulated attack on the Royal Navy anchorage at Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands intended to test the base's defences. Lieutenant McFarlane was assigned to carry out the attack in X-22, but while being towed to the target by the submarine HMS Certis, the 2 vessels collided in a storm and X-22 was lost with all hands. The mission was ultimately completed by Lieutenant Maxwell Sheen of the Royal Australian Naval Volunteer Reserve, who was selected to lead the 12th Flotilla's next combat mission, Operation Guidance, and attempt to destroy the Laskavag floating dock at Bergen in Norway. The attack was launched on April 14, 1944, with Sheen and his crew in X-24 infiltrating the anchorage, laying their charges and rendezvousing with the towing submarine without incident. However, aerial reconnaissance revealed that X-24 had not in fact sunk the dock, but rather the German cargo ship Bauernfels. As it turns out, the charts Lieutenant Sheen who had been provided were out of date, and an additional berth of similar orientation had since been added by the Germans. Nonetheless, the mission was deemed a success, and Sheen was awarded the Distinguished Service Order. 5 months later, on September the 11th, X-24, commanded by Lieutenant Percy Westmagott, returned to Bergen as part of Operation Heckle. This time, the X-craft succeeded in destroying the floating dock as well as 2 small merchant ships, the Sten and the Oscar II. Meanwhile, other elements of the 12th Flotilla were engaged in a very different kind of mission, helping Allied planners prepare for the upcoming Operation Overlord landings in Normandy, France. Known as Operation Postage Able, the mission was intended to collect intelligence on the composition and topography of the landing beaches to ensure that landing craft, vehicles, and troops could safely get ashore. On January 15, 1944, X-20 set off from Scotland for the Normandy coast. Aboard were a regular Royal Navy crew commanded by Lieutenant Ken Hudspeth, as well as 3 divers of the Combined Operations Pilotage Parties, or COPP. During the day, the crew conducted shore reconnaissance using the periscope and echo soundings of the sea floor, while at night the divers swam out to the beaches and collected samples of sand and soil and condoms for later analysis. Of these highly dangerous missions, the divers were armed with only knives and pistols. Surveys were conducted off Vierville-sur-Mer, Moulins-Saint-Laurent, and Corville-sur-Mer in the American Omaha Beach sector, with plans to proceed to the Orkney Estuary in the British Sword Beach sector. However, by this time, the crew was so exhausted that Lieutenant Hudspeth decided to cut the mission short and return to base. For this action, Hudspeth received a bar on his DSC. X-craft also played an important role in the Overlord landings themselves. As part of Operation Gambit on June 4, 1944, X-20 and X-23 took up positions off the western edge of Sword Beach and the eastern edge of Juno Beach. There they remained, sitting on the seafloor until the morning of June 6th, when they surfaced and deployed light and radio beacons to guide the invading fleet onto the landing beaches. This mission earned Lieutenant Hudspeth yet another bar in his DSC. Due to their impressive service in Europe, the X-craft was adapted for use in the Far East. Known as the XE class, these new submarines were slightly larger than the original X-craft and featured a number of modifications to make them more comfortable to operate in the tropics. However, they were no less dangerous, with one XE craft, XE-11, being lost during a training exercise in Loch Striven on March 6, 1945. The crew, led by Lieutenant Aubrey Staples, had trimmed their craft at 100 feet and begun a gradual ascent. Unknown to them, however, the boom defense vessel Mariner had stopped directly above, and as the submarine neared the surface, the two vessels collided, tearing holes in XE-11's hull and sending her to the bottom. Crew members Bill Morrison and Les Swatton were able to force the escape hatch open and swim to the surface, but the other three men were lost. Once training was complete, the remaining XE craft and their crews sailed to the Far East aboard their tender HMS Bonadventure, reaching Labuan in Malaya in July 1945. Their mission was to cut the Japanese submarine communication cables that linked Singapore, Hong Kong, and Saigon. This would force the Japanese to communicate by radio, whose signals could be intercepted and decoded by Allied intelligence. The first of these missions, Operation Sabre, was launched on July 31, 1945 by XE-4, commanded by Lieutenant Maxwell Sheen. XE-4 was towed to within 64 kilometers of the Mekong Delta by the submarine HMS Spearhead, whereupon she began searching for the cable using a towed grappling hook. She eventually snagged the cable and managed to haul it 3 meters off at the seabed, where diver Sub-Lieutenant Kenneth Briggs used a torpedo net cutter to sever it. Soon after, the crew snagged and raised a second cable, which was severed by Sub-Lieutenant Adam Bergius. 2 divers were carried due to the breathing equipment they carried, which used pure oxygen rather than compressed air. Below 12 meters, breathing oxygen at pressure can lead to oxygen poisoning, meaning that the divers could not work at such depths for more than 10 minutes at a time. The mission complete, XE-4 returned to Labuan on August 3rd, earning Sheen another DSO and Briggs the Distinguished Service Cross. Soon after, the XE-5, under Lieutenant Herbert Westmacott, set off on Operation Foil, targeting the Hong Kong to Singapore cable. Towed to the target by HMS Celine, XE-5 dived and located the cable off Lammer Island. Unfortunately, working conditions were poor, the divers having to work in thick mud and dangerous depths to sever the cable. Indeed, they were unsure whether they had even succeeded, and it was not until after the war that captured Japanese reports confirmed that the cable had indeed been severed. The most spectacular XE craft operation of the war, however, was Operation Struggle, launched on July 31st, 1945, against the Japanese heavy cruisers Takao and Miyoko in Singapore Harbor. 2 craft participated in the operation, XE-1 commanded by Lieutenant Jack Smart and XE-3 commanded by Lieutenant Ian Fraser. After being towed close to the target by the submarines HMS Stygian and HMS Spark, XE-1 and XE-3 spent 11 hours navigating up the Straits of Johor, dodging Japanese patrol vessels and other harbor defenses. Finally, however, Lieutenant Fraser managed to reach Takao and drop his side cargoes, while diver acting seaman Hames McGuinness exited the craft to attach 6 additional limpet mines. Unfortunately, the Takao's hull was covered in a thick layer of seaweed that prevented magnetic mines from sticking, so McGuinness was forced to improvise by tying the explosives on with a rope. More trouble soon appeared as one of the side cargoes failed to separate cleanly from the hull, but McGuinness was able to pry it loose with a spanner. Worse still, the receding tide nearly caused the Takao to crush XE-3 against the harbor bottom, forcing a now exhausted McGuinness to heroically dislodge the submarine and allow it to escape. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Smart in XE-1 found himself pinned down by patrol boats and unable to penetrate further into the harbor. He thus elected to drop his side cargoes beneath Takao before escaping and rendezvousing with his tow submarine. When the explosives detonated, they blew a 10 by 20 meter hole in the Takao's hull and flooded several compartments, putting her out of action for the remainder of the war. For this action, Fraser and McGuinness received the Victoria Cross. More XE craft operations against Japanese shipping were planned, but the war ended before they could be carried out. Though other belligerent nations, including Japan, Italy, and Germany, also deployed Midget submarines during the war, none achieved anything approaching the effectiveness of the British X-craft. Over their brief 2-year operational history, these vessels damaged or sank 5 enemy vessels and played pivotal roles in major operations in both the Europe and the Pacific theaters, rendering service far out of proportion to their diminutive size. In the process, their brave crews earned an impressive 4 Victoria Crosses, 8 Distinguished Service Orders, 15 Distinguished Service Crosses, 4 Distinguished Service Medals, and 2 Conspicuous Gallantry Medals. But this success came at a cost, with 23 X-craft crews losing their lives in the line of duty. Today, only 2 of these unique craft survive, X-24 preserved at the Royal Navy Submarine Museum at Gosport and XE-8 on display at the Chatham Historic Dockyards. In the early morning hours of June the 6th, 1944, a massive armada set sail from southeast England and steamed across the English Channel, comprising more than 7,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 156,000 troops. It was the largest amphibious invasion force in history. At 6:30 a.m., after some 23,000 airborne troops had landed behind enemy lines, the main seaborne force stormed ashore on the beaches of Normandy. Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of France, had begun. Though the fighting was fierce, within 24 hours, Operation Overlord had achieved its main objective, securing a solid foothold in Western Europe. It was a major turning point in the Second World War and marked the beginning of the end for Adolf Hitler's Third Reich. Within 11 months, both the Eastern and Western Allies had advanced across the continent into the heart of Germany, Hitler had committed suicide, and the war in Europe was finally brought to a close. But the stunning success of Operation Overlord relied on more than men, ships, aircraft, and tanks. For months prior to D-Day, Allied intelligence agencies executed a vast, shadowy operation on a scale comparable to the actual landings themselves. A grand, elaborate deception meant to deceive the Germans as to the timing, location, and the intent of the invasion and prevent Allied forces from being driven back into the sea. This is the story of Operation Bodyguard, one of the largest and most successful deceptions in military history. When the Western Allies began planning the invasion of France in May 1943, the task they faced was a daunting one. For protecting the western coast of Europe was the Atlantic Wall, a formidable line of fortifications stretching from the northern tip of Norway to the Spanish border. Built by forced laborers of the infamous organization Todt, the wall comprised some 6,000 reinforced concrete gun emplacements, pillboxes, and other bunkers, along with millions of landmines, hundreds of kilometers of barbed wire, and thousands of steel obstacles called hedgehogs and Belgian gates, meant to rip open the hulls of landing craft as they approached the beach. But as formidable as the Atlantic Wall appeared on paper, it had one crucial weakness: manpower. With the bulk of their forces tied up fighting on the Eastern Front, the Germans were desperately short of men with which to defend the west coast of Europe. At the time of the Overlord landings, the commander of German forces in the West, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, had less than 500,000 men to defend the whole of France, consisting of the 1st and 19th Armies of Army Group G in the south and the 7th and 15th Armies of Army Group B in the north. Many of these units, fresh from the Eastern Front, were exhausted from combat and had not yet regained full operational strength. Many were composed of Russian conscripts or older soldiers equipped with inferior equipment, while the German army as a whole was desperately short on fuel and vehicles and was largely reliant on horse transport. Though the Germans knew an Allied invasion was imminent, they were unsure exactly where the blow would fall, and without sufficient troops to adequately man the Atlantic Wall along its entire 5,000-kilometer length, they faced a daunting defensive dilemma. In November 1943, Hitler appointed a new General Inspector of Western Defenses, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, whose exploits in the North African campaign had earned him the nickname the Desert Fox. Seeing the desperate state of German forces in the West, Rommel concluded that if an invasion could not be stopped on the beach, Germany was doomed. He thus ordered the laying of more mines and beach obstacles, as well as the flooding of fields and the planting of sharpened stakes, known as Rommel's asparagus, to deter landings by airborne troops. The German High Command, however, disagreed with Rommel's assessment and instead opted for a composite strategy, holding many units, including 6 SS Panzer divisions, in reserve inland, ready to rush and reinforce the site of the invasion when it came. Yet despite the poor state of the German defenders, they were still experienced combat veterans and would greatly outnumber the initial waves of Allied invaders, making Operation Overlord an extremely risky prospect. But the German manpower shortage gave the Allies an enormous advantage. For if the Germans could be fooled into thinking the invasion would land elsewhere, they would redeploy their troops to defend the false target, rendering them unavailable to counter the actual invasion. In November 1943, Colonel John Bevan, head of the London Controlling Section, the shadowy organisation in charge of all Allied intelligence agencies, presented a draft deception plan at the Allied Leaders' Conference in Tehran. Codenamed Jael after the biblical heroine who defeated the Canaanite commander Sisera by means of deception, the plan outlined an elaborate series of deceptions intended to convince the Germans that the Allied invasion would be directed at multiple points along the entire coast of Europe, including Norway and the Balkans, rather than the Normandy coast. The plan appealed immensely to British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who had previously written that, to quote, "There is required for the composition of a great commander not only massive common sense and reasoning power, but also an element of legerdemain, an original and sinister touch, which leaves the enemy puzzled as well as beaten." After extensive revisions by British Army Colonel David Strangeways, the jail plan was approved under the codename Operation Bodyguard, named for another of Churchill's wartime quotes: "In wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies." Bodyguard was not one operation, but it was many, each designed to feed the Germans a small piece of a much larger narrative. Operations Grafham and Royal Flush, for example, were intended to convince the Germans that the Allies planned to invade Norway. As part of these operations, Allied diplomats opened negotiations with neutral Sweden, with the aim of gaining permission to land and refuel aircraft in Swedish territory during the planned invasion, and convincing the Swedes to break their neutrality and side with the Allies. Meanwhile, Allied agents began conspicuously inspecting Swedish rail and port facilities, the British Treasury began investing in Scandinavian securities, and the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, launched its own deception campaign to convince the Germans that the Red Army was massing in Murmansk and Petsamo in order to invade Norway from the other side. Though the Allies had no intention of actually swaying the Swedish government as planned, news of the negotiations soon reached Berlin via German agents in Sweden and Norway. In a classic case of knowing one's enemy, these deceptions played on Hitler's known paranoia regarding Norway, which supplied the majority of the iron ore that he needed to fuel his war machine. Similarly, Operations Zeppelin, Vendetta, and Copperhead sought to convince the Germans that the Allies planned to land troops in the Mediterranean, specifically in the Balkans, Crete, Romania, and the south of France. Like Royal Flush, Vendetta involved Allied diplomats opening negotiations with a neutral power, in this case Spain, leading the Germans to believe that the country might switch sides and act as a land conduit for a coming invasion. Meanwhile, Operation Zeppelin used fake radio traffic to convince the Germans that the British 9th, 10th, and 12th armies were massing in Egypt for preparation for an invasion of the Balkans, while Operation Copperhead involved one of the strangest and unlikeliest deceptions of the entire war. In early 1944, British Army intelligence discovered that one Emmy Clifton James, an actor serving as a lieutenant in the Royal Army Pay Corps, bore a striking resemblance to British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commander of all Allied forces for Operation Overlord. James was recruited by none other than actor David Niven, then working for the Army's film unit, and agreed to be transformed into Montgomery's double. This proved more challenging than expected. For one thing, James smoked and drank heavily, while the real Monty was a teetotaler. James had also lost a finger during the First World War and had to be fitted with a prosthetic. Nonetheless, James eventually learns Montgomery's speech patterns and mannerisms, and in May 1944 embarked on an official tour of the Mediterranean theatre with stops in Gibraltar, Algiers, and Cairo. The hope was that Montgomery's apparent presence in the area would convince the Germans that the planned Allied invasion would come from the south rather than the west. However, the largest and most elaborate component of Operation Bodyguard was Operation Fortitude, which itself was divided into two sub-operations: Fortitude North, codenamed Sky, and Fortitude South, codenamed Quicksilver. Working in tandem with Operations Grafham and Royal Flush, Sky sought to create the illusion that a fictitious British Fourth Army, numbering 250,000 men and led by General Sir Andrew Thorne, was massing in Scotland for a planned invasion of Norway. To this end, armies of workmen built fake troop encampments complete with tents, barracks, trucks, and other equipment out of wood, canvas, and chicken wire. Meanwhile, hundreds of inflatable tanks made by the Dunlop Rubber Company and dummy aircraft built of wood and burlap were lined up in fields, while fake wooden and inflatable landing barges, nicknamed Big Bobs and Wet Bobs, were moored along rivers, canals, and docks, creating the illusion of a massive invasion force. So devoted were the workmen to selling this illusion that they often got carried away with the fine details. Fake landing craft were festooned with sailors' laundry, puffed smoke from their exhaust stacks, and played dance music on their radios, while real tugboats zigzagged around the harbours to simulate regular activity. At night, arrangements of moving lamps known as queue lights were used to similar effect. Where dummy tanks were deployed, weighted trailers with specially textured wheels were towed about to create realistic tracks, while in towns where the Fourth Army's troops troops were supposedly billeted, local newspapers were seeded with announcements for regimental dances, sports matches, weddings, and other social events, details any German spies in the area were certain to report on. But even these fakes would not hold up to close scrutiny, so to ensure that German reconnaissance aircraft photographed the sites but didn't get too close, anti-aircraft gunners were instructed to aim poorly but keep any intruders flying above 30,000 feet. Meanwhile, in the southeast of England, another even larger Phantom Army was being conjured as part of Operation Quicksilver. While the Germans did not know exactly where in France the Allies would land, they had their suspicions. Disturbingly, Adolf Hitler himself intuited that the most likely landing site would be Normandy, though many of his generals disagreed, believing instead that the invasion would come at the Pas-de-Calais, located at the narrowest point of the English Channel. The Pas-de-Calais is only 34 kilometers from the English coast and is the shortest crossing between the two countries. It was also the most direct route into Germany's industrial heartland in the Ruhr Valley and held a number of major ports that the Allies would need to offload men and supplies at to sustain a prolonged invasion. Unknown to the Germans, the disastrous Dieppe raid of August 19, 1942, in which nearly 4,000 British and Canadian troops had been killed, wounded, or captured, had convinced Allied planners that attacking a well-defended port would be suicide. Instead, the Operation Overlord Force would carry and assemble its own prefabricated harbours, codenamed Mulberries, allowing supplies to be unloaded directly onto the invasion beaches. That the Germans expected an invasion at the Pas-de-Calais was a logical assumption, given that of the 179 heavy gun emplacements along the coast of France, 132 were situated in that area. The aim of Operation Quicksilver was thus to confirm the German suspicions. As with Operation Sky, Quicksilver involved the creation of an imaginary army, in this case the 1st US Army Group, or FUSAG, comprising 50 divisions of American and Canadian troops under the command of legendary General George S. Patton. This Phantom Force was stationed in Dover, directly across from the Pas-de-Calais, giving little doubt as to its intended target. As with its northern counterpart, Quicksilver made extensive use of fake encampments, inflatable tanks and landing craft, and other dummies to fool German reconnaissance aircraft. One of these installations was involved in an amusing incident in which an enraged bull escaped from a nearby farm and proceeded to gore one of the inflatable tanks to death, marking the one and only time FUSAG was involved in actual combat. With no less attention to detail than Operation Sky, the Quicksilver team even went so far as to create distinctive insignia for each division within FUSAG, which were worn by a small contingent of soldiers who were circulated through the town surrounding Dover, creating the illusion of a much larger force. Perhaps the most elaborate charade of Operation Quicksilver was the construction of an entire fake oil terminal near Dover, suggesting the existence of a cross-channel pipeline to supply the invasion force. Designed by architect Basil Spence and built of wood, canvas and sewer pipe by set decorators from Shepperton Studios, the terminal was given added credibility via official inspections by Field Marshal Montgomery, General Dwight Eisenhower, and even George VI. Indeed, so convincing was the illusion that the German long-range guns at Cape Grenade occasionally opened fire on the terminal, forcing workmen to simulate realistic shell damage using flares and smoke generators. But while the inflatable tanks, dummy aircraft, and other physical deceptions are the most memorable facet of Operation Fortitude, in reality, these formed only a minor part of the whole deception. Indeed, there was little need for visual deception, for barely anybody was looking. By 1944, Allied air superiority was so complete that few German aircraft dared venture over the British Isles, and there was little risk of German spies spotting and reporting the fake armies for the simple reason that there weren't any. Though the Germans had landed dozens of spies in Britain since the beginning of the war, every single one had been captured by or surrendered to the British Security Service, better known as MI5. More astonishingly still, the vast majority of these spies had been turned into double agents as part of a massive covert operation known as the Double Cross System. An intelligence coup on the scale of breaking the German Enigma code, the Double Cross System gave MI5 near total control over all human intelligence reaching Berlin from Britain, allowing them to shape the narrative of Allied war plans in any way that they pleased. While dozens of double agents were employed in the lead up to D-Day, the key players were the agents codenamed Mutt, Jeff, Brutus, Tricycle, and Garbo. Mutt and Jeff, real names John Moe and Tor Glad, were Norwegians landed on the coast of Aberdeenshire, Scotland in 1941. They immediately turned themselves in and joined the Double Cross System, feeding their German handlers intelligence on the supposed build-up of troops in Scotland as part of Operation Sky. To allay suspicions that Mutt and Jeff had been turned, MI5 staged a series of publicised sabotage attacks attributed to the pair, including a controlled explosion at a power plant. Meanwhile, agents Brutus, Tricycle, and Garbo were employed as part of Operation Quicksilver to convince the Germans that the main Allied invasion would come at the Pas-de-Calais. Brutus, real name Roman Garby Cherniowski, was a Polish Air Force officer who agreed to spy for the Germans and was sent to England only to immediately turn himself in and work for British intelligence. Tricycle, real name Dusko Popov, was a wealthy Serbian playboy who used his extravagant lifestyle as cover for his spying and was one of the inspirations for the character of James Bond. Indeed, his codename was reportedly a reference to his fondness for menage a trois. But the real star of Double Cross was Agent Garbo, a man with a life story so audacious and unlikely it deserves its own detailed video. Garbo, real name Juan Pujol Garcia, was a Spanish national who at the outbreak of war volunteered his services as a spy to the British. When he was rejected, he instead approached the German Abwehr, or military intelligence, and offered to spy on the British. Given a radio and dispatched to England, Pujol instead set up shop in Lisbon and proceeded to feed the Germans a steady stream of fabricated intelligence supplied by a completely fictitious network of 27 agents. The Germans ate up every word and counted him among their most valuable agents, even going so far as to award him the Iron Cross Second Class. Pujol's unlikely success soon caught the attention of British intelligence, who finally invited him to work for them. Among the intelligence Pujol fed to the Germans was the complete composition of the Calais invasion force, which was so thoroughly accepted that German maps captured after the actual invasion showed the Allied order of battle exactly as Pujol had reported it. But Pujol's greatest coup came on the evening of June 5, 1944, when he reported that the Canadian army had been issued with seasickness bags and marched away, indicating that an invasion was imminent. However, Pujol's contact in Madrid was asleep and did not receive the message until 8 hours later, after the invasion was already well underway. This gamble convinced the Germans that Pujol's intelligence was genuine and would pay huge dividends just a few days later. Another major element of fortitude was the creation of fake radio traffic for the Germans to listen in on. For Operation Sky, this radio traffic was transmitted by operators stationed in Edinburgh Castle and consisted of the mundane messages one would expect from an active army, peppered with subtle references to winter warfare, such as requisitions for skis and crampons, plans for ski training of troops, and data on the performance of tank engines in cold weather. Quicksilver's radio traffic, transmitted from Dover Castle, was of a similar nature, but filled with oblique references to Calais. One such message fit squarely into the category of so ridiculous it must be genuine, and quickly became legendary. Quote, 5th Queen's Royal Regiments report a number of civilian women, presumably unauthorized, in the baggage train. What are we going to do with them? Take them to Calais? Other deceptions in the lead up to D-Day were even more subtle. In order to destroy transport infrastructure and disrupt German logistics behind the lines, the Allied air forces launched Operation Point Blank, a campaign of bombing raids against the French countryside. In order to maintain the pretense that the main invasion target was Calais, the Allies adopted a 2-for-1 policy, whereby every raid against Normandy was matched by 2 raids against Calais. It is impossible to overstate the immensity of the task and the risks the planners of Operation Bodyguard were undertaking. Every element of the grand deception had to fit together perfectly, like the pieces of an enormous jigsaw puzzle with no gaps or contradictions. If the Germans suspected even one thread of the narrative the Allies were spinning, then the whole charade would unravel and Operation Overlord would be doomed. As General Frederick Morgan, Deputy Chief of Staff for Allied Supreme Headquarters, later wrote, "The great shadow boxing match has to go on without a break. One bogus impression in the enemy's mind had to be succeeded by another equally bogus. There had to be an unbroken plausibility to it all, and ever present must be the ultimate aim, which was to arrange that the eventual blow would come where the enemy least expected it, with a force altogether outside its calculations. Yet against all odds, Bodyguard succeeded. The Germans, fully convinced that the Allies would land at the Pas de Calais, pulled the majority of their troops out of Normandy and stationed their reserves far behind the lines. Hundreds of thousands of troops were also retained in Norway and the Mediterranean, incapable of contributing to the defense of France. Thus, when the Allies finally hit the invasion force, they faced a much reduced defending force. But the deceptions did not stop at fortitude and carried on right up to the moment of the landings and beyond. In the early morning hours of June 6, 1944, the Royal Air Force and Royal Navy launched a series of feints codenamed Operation Glimmer, Taxable, a Big Drum. Carried out by the RAF's famous No. 617 Dam Busters Squadron, Glimmer and Taxable involved the deployment of one of the war's most effective secret weapons, strips of metal foil codenamed Window. Known today as chaff, Window was to cut through the wavelength of the enemy's radar, creating a strong echo that could mimic the signature of a large formation of aircraft or jam the radar entirely. Flying rotating sorties, the bombers of 617 Squadron dropped a steadily advancing cloud of window over the English Channel, simulating an armada of aircraft heading toward Calais. Meanwhile, in Operation Big Drum, Royal Navy motor launchers steamed toward Calais, towing radar reflectors suspended from balloons, simulating the advance of the invasion fleet. Coincident of these naval and air operations, the British Army launched Operation Titanic, an effort to convince the Germans that airborne troops had landed in the Calais region. This involved aircraft dropping dummy parachuters, codenamed Ruperts, around the cities of Marigny, Fourville, and Caen. Each Rupert was equipped with noisemakers to simulate rifle fire and a timed explosive charge to destroy the dummy. At the same time, men of the Elite Special Air Service, or SAS, parachuted into the region and created chaos by opening fire on German troops and playing 30-minute recordings of men shouting and weapons firing. Though 2 aircraft were lost and 8 SAS men were killed, the operation was a success, sowing much confusion among the German defenders. But while Operation Bodyguard allowed the Allies to secure a foothold across a 50-kilometer front, the success of Overlord was still not assured. Allied forces still needed time to dig in, assemble the Mulberry harbours, and begin shipping in the men and supplies needed to press deeper into France. If the Germans could mobilise their reserve forces quickly enough, they could still throw the invasion force back into the sea. Indeed, while the Germans firmly believed that the Normandy landings were merely a feint and that the real invasion would soon come at Calais, after D-Day +2, they began to waver, and Hitler ordered the 1st SS Panzer Division deployed from Calais to Normandy. And it is here that Juan Pujol's, aka Agent Garbo's, gamble on the 5th of June paid off. On that same day, Pujol sent the following message to his handlers in Madrid. From the reports mentioned, it is perfectly clear that the present attack on Normandy by the 21st Army Group is a large-scale operation, but diversionary in character, for the purpose of establishing a strong bridgehead in order to draw the maximum of our reserves to the area of operation, to retain them there so as to be able to strike a blow somewhere else with ensured success. The constant aerial bombardment which the area of the Pas-de-Calais has suffered and the strategic disposition of these forces give reason to suspect an attack in the region of France, which at this time offers the shortest route for the final objective of their illusions, which is to say Berlin. Once again, the Germans swallowed Pujol's lie whole and cancelled the order for the redeploy of the 1st Panzer Division. The unit would remain in Calais for another week, by which time the Allies had landed 326,000 men, 50,000 vehicles, and 100,000 tons of equipment on the beaches of Normandy, making the invasion force virtually impossible to dislodge. In fact, Operation Bodyguard succeeded beyond what even its planners thought possible. While London Controlling Section hoped to delay the German counterattack by 10 to 14 days at most, so convinced was Hitler that the real invasion was just around the corner that he did not release his reserves for a full 7 weeks, giving the Allies all the time they needed to break out of Normandy and invade the rest of France. Operation Bodyguard was one of the most audacious, elaborate, and successful deceptions in military history, paving the way for the eventual Allied victory in the West. So crucial was the operation to the ultimate success of Operation Bodyguard that in his post-war report to the Combined Chiefs of Staff, Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower wrote that lack of infantry was the most important cause of the enemy's defeat on Normandy, and his failure to remedy this weakness was due primarily to the threat levelled against the Pas-de-Calais. This threat, which had proved of so much value in misleading the enemy as to the true objectives of our invasion preparations, was maintained after June the 6th, and it served most effectively to pin down the German 15th Army east of the Seine, while we built up our strength in the lodgement area to the west. I cannot overemphasize the decision value of this most successful threat, which paid enormous dividends both at the time of the assault and during the operations of the 2 succeeding months. The German 15th Army, which, if committed to battle in June or July, might possibly have defeated us by sheer weight of numbers, remained inoperative during the critical period of the campaign, and only when the breakthrough had been achieved were its infantry divisions brought west across the Seine, too late to have any effect upon the course of victory.
Throughout the 1930s, pilots around the world were continually trying to push the limits of anything that had been done before in the air. While the likes of Charles Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart are more familiar names in the Western world, the Soviets had their own equivalents, such as Mikhail Gromov, who, in 1937, along with his 2-man crew, managed to break the world distance record for non-stop flight, flying 6,306 miles from Moscow to California via a rather dangerous North Pole route. Hailed as heroes upon their return, Premier Joseph Stalin decided the Soviet Union should follow this up in 1938 by having a group of women pilots attempt to set the distance record for nonstop flight for a female crew. The selected trio, who each already held one or more world records for female aviators, were Polina Osipenko, Valentina Grizadubova, and the woman who would ultimately form the squadron that is the subject of today's video, Marina Reskova. And so it was that on September the 24th, 1938, the three ladies took off from a field near Moscow in a Tupolev Ant-37, which normally had a range of about 5,000 kilometers or 3,100 miles. Their destination was Komsomolsk on Amur, over 3,600 miles away. Unfortunately for them, almost immediately upon departing, they encountered a number of issues, including a thick layer of clouds and icing conditions, which forced them to climb above said clouds, in the process losing all sight of the ground for the duration. Not long after this, their radio stopped working. Without a clear view of the ground for almost the entire flight, Reskova used the stars, a compass, and their airspeed to roughly determine their position as they flew. When the clouds finally broke, they found themselves flying over Tugur Bay in the Sea of Okhotsk, about 500 kilometers or 300 miles directly north of their intended destination. Low on fuel, they desperately attempted to find an alternate place to land, but the engines died first. With some form of crash landing inevitable and the navigator no longer having anything to do, Grizadubova ordered Reskova to parachute out of the plane from about 6,500 feet with hope that it would increase her odds of survival. However, decreasing her odds slightly, she chose to leave her emergency survival kit for the other two women, reportedly only taking 2 chocolate bars with her for rations to trek through Siberia with. When Reskova safely hit the ground, she noted the direction the plane was gliding and began hiking after it. As for the pilot and co-pilot still aboard, they were forced to make a gear-up, dead-stick landing in a frozen swamp near the upper part of the Amgun River, in the end successfully executing what is termed in pilot speak as a good landing, in that all occupants survived and were able to walk away from the wreckage. As for Reskova, she hiked for a full 10 days before finally locating the downed aircraft and her comrades. Not long before she arrived, a search crew located the plane. While this was a good thing for the women, unfortunately 2 of the search planes collided overhead, killing all 15 aboard as the horrified stranded pilots watched from below. A few days later, the women were picked up via boat. When they arrived back in Moscow, their harrowing journey, which managed 3,671.44 miles in 26 hours and 29 minutes, though in truth it was determined they had flown some 6,450 kilometers or 4,007 miles total, had indeed set the record for a straight-line, non-stop, all-women crew. That, along with how they handled themselves in such adverse conditions, saw them lauded as heroes across the Union, including quite literally being given the Hero of the Soviet Union Award, among other honors. Fast forward about 3 years later, in June of 1941, Germany decided to invade. During Operation Barbarossa, almost 4 million troops were thrown at the Soviet Union, and in one fell swoop, the Axis managed to destroy approximately 66 airfields and about 80% of the military aircraft in the Soviet Union at the time. Now, with an abundance of pilots and few planes, you might think this was not exactly an ideal environment for female pilots of the era to be given a job, especially not in combat. But 2 factors saw Stalin convinced establishing an all-female squadron was something they should do. First, Reskova wouldn't stop berating Stalin about it, noting both in the air and on the ground that foregoing using half of your populace when the enemy was almost at the doorsteps of Moscow was foolish. Another factor was that among the planes still available were a large number of Polikarpov PO-2s, an open-cockpit 2-seat 1928 biplane made of wood and fabric, mostly meant for flight training and crop dusting. Slow and plodding, the Polikarpov cruised along at a breakneck pace of about 68 miles per hour, or about 109 kilometers per hour, and a never exceed, if you don't want your wings to fall off, speed of 94 miles per hour, or 151 kilometers per hour. Combine that with a maximum climb rate of a mere 500 feet, or 152 meters per minute, while traveling at a speed not that much faster than Usain Bolt while ascending, and these weren't exactly planes male pilots were itching to fly to the front in. For reference here, the Luftwaffe were flying such planes as the Focke-Wulf FW-190 Verger, which had an engine possessing about 25 times the horsepower as the Polikarpov, cruised along at 280 miles per hour, or 450 kilometers per hour, with maximum speeds of 426 miles per hour, or 685 kilometers per hour, and could climb in excess of 3,000 feet per minute. That's not to mention this plane came equipped with dual 13mm MG-131 machine guns. The pilots of the Polikarpov PO-2s, on the other hand, as mentioned, were given hand pistols as their air-to-air combat weapon. No doubt when in a dogfight, they were also instructed to make pew-pew-pew sounds to increase the effectiveness of their arsenal. If all that wasn't bad enough, should one get shot down or the fabric of the aircraft catch fire, which occasionally happened when tracer bullets ripped through them, as weight was at a premium, the pilots weren't given parachutes. On top of that, the planes themselves did not come equipped with radios or any other such equipment. A map, a compass, a pistol, and their wits were what the stick and rudder PO2 pilots brought with them on their combat missions. Now you might at this point be wondering what possible use these pilots could serve flying these planes into combat other than reducing the Soviet population by a couple hundred pilots. Well, the one marginal potent weapon the planes did come equipped with was bombs, up to 6 of them, weighing approximately 110 pounds each or 50 kilograms. And so it was that all these planes few wanted to fly sitting on the ground, and Roscova refusing to shut up about it, Stalin ordered her to form 3 all-female squadrons, though the 588th Bomber Regiment, who had come to use the PO2s, was the only one to remain exclusively staffed by women throughout the war. As for the young ladies who volunteered to fly in these death traps, they ranged from about 17 years old to their early 20s, and while you might think the name they'd soon be given would be something along the lines of target practice, their incredible effectiveness and near non-stop bombardment of the Germans at the front starting on June the 8th, 1942, and continuing all the way to Berlin earned them the nickname the Night Witches. So just how effective were they? For the approximately 4 years they were active, they flew close to an astounding 30,000 missions, with an average of about 250 missions each. To put this in perspective, airmen aboard a B-17 Flying Fortress in 1944 had a 1 in 4 chance of surviving to the 25 mission mark for their rotation. But in the case of the Night Witch bombers, some flew near or greater than that number in under a week. One, who we'll discuss shortly, almost managed that number of missions in a single night. Despite the incredible number of missions they flew over the course of the war, of the 261 women that flew in the 588th, only 32 died, and a handful of those not from combat, but tuberculosis. This brings us to Nadezhda Popova, who managed the record of 18 missions in a single night when she helped chase the Axis as they retreated from Poland. Popova, who started flying at the age of 15, was a flight instructor by 18 and decided to join up not long after her brother, Leonid, was killed in the early stages of the conflict. She states, "I saw the German aircraft flying along our roads filled with people who were leaving their homes, firing at them with their machine guns. Seeing this gave me feelings inside that made me want to fight them." The Nazis would soon come to regret making an enemy of Popova, who shortly was about to go all John Wick on them for killing her brother. But before that, unfortunately for her, when she tried to enlist, she was turned away, with Popova later stating this, "No one in the armed services wants to give women the freedom to die." Nevertheless, given her credentials when the 588th was formed when she was 19 years old, they had a place for her. She would go on to fly an incredible 852 missions during the war, despite, as she stated in an interview in 2009, almost every time we had to sail through a wall of enemy fire. In winter, when you'd look out to see your target better, you'd get frostbite. Our feet froze in our boots, but we carried on flying. It was a miracle we didn't lose more aircraft. Our planes were the slowest in the Air Force. They often came back riddled with bullets. On that note, after returning from one mission where she was tasked with dropping supplies to ground troops who were bottled up in the Malaya Zemlya, she found 42 bullet holes in her plane, 1 in her helmet, and a couple in her map. It was then that she joked with her navigator, "Katia, my dear, we will live long." In truth, Popova, who became a squadron commander, survived the war, among other honors receiving the Hero of the Soviet Union, the Order of Lenin, and was a 3-time Order of the Red Banner recipient, awarded for extreme heroism and courage demonstrated in battle. She was also twice awarded the Order of the Patriotic War First Class, and the list goes on and on and on. As for her life after, she married an airman, Semyon Kharlamov, who she met after the two had separately been shot down on August 2nd, 1942. While she couldn't see his face as it was covered in blood and bandages, they hit it off as they joked around together during their trek back to safety. They got hitched almost immediately on war's end. For work after, she continued her pre-war career as a flight instructor, ultimately living to the ripe old age of 91 years old, dying on July the 8th, 2013. Going back to the squadron as a whole, given their extreme vulnerability in the air, you might at this point be wondering how these women not only almost all survived, but proved to be so incredibly effective at their job. Well, given their slow speed, the fact that in a dogfight they'd quickly be made into Swiss cheese by enemy planes, and the fact that they needed to deploy their paltry payloads at extremely low altitudes to actually accurately hit a target, meaning ground-based crew could likewise easily turn the pilots of these craft into wreckage riders, flying missions in daylight with any regularity wasn't really an option if one liked to keep breathing. Thus, in an era before incredibly accurate terrain mapping and GPS systems to help avoid said terrain, these women voluntarily hopped inside their antiquated pieces of equipment with a pistol and a prayer and ascended to the heavens in darkness. The darker the better. Stealth was their only way of surviving, and they used it to their advantage at every opportunity, navigating in darkness toward their assigned enemy targets, usually hugging the ground as much as possible until getting close to their targets to avoid being spotted by enemy aircraft. Once they located their targets, the women would employ a number of strategies to actually get close enough to deliver their deadly payloads. These included doing things like flying in groups and intentionally having one or two of the planes up high attract the attention and fire from those on the ground, while others would idle their engine and try to slip in closely undetected. Another strategy was to do what is generally considered in Aviation 101 as a great way to die, especially in the often frigid environments these women were flying in, cut their engines completely in flight and at relatively low altitudes. They then silently descend onto their targets until almost literally right over their heads of the enemy and finally drop their bombs, kick the engines back to life, hopefully, and get back to base as fast as possible to be loaded back up and sent out again and again and again to the front line. Describing this, the Chief of Staff for the 588th, Irina Rakobolskaya, noted, "One girl managed to fly 7 times to the front line and back in her plane. She would return shaking, and they would hang new bombs, refuel her plane, and she'd go off to bomb the target again." Popova would state of this strategy, "We flew in sequence one after another, and during the night we never let them rest. The Germans made up stories. They spread the rumor that we had been injected with some unknown chemicals that enabled us to see so clearly at night. This was nonsense, of course. What we did have were clever, educated, very talented girls." Effective, one German soldier would later state in an interview after the War of the Night Witches, "They were precise, merciless, and came from nowhere." Dedicated to delivering their payloads no matter what, one former 588th member stated that occasionally the bombs would get stuck when trying to drop them just over the target. The solution was simply to have one of the 2 women in the plane scramble out on the wing and kick it loose, often while under heavy enemy fire, all leading author Kate Quinn to note, "You women are crazy. You're incredibly brave, but my God, you're crazy." A sentiment Popova would later echo in her waning years, stating, "I sometimes stare into the blackness and close my eyes. I can still imagine myself as a young girl up there in my little bomber, and I ask myself, Nadia, how did you do it?" Moving on to the nickname the Germans gave them, and which they would so proudly embrace once they learned of it, it is widely speculated that this was because of the whooshing sound the planes made as they glided down through the air, like the sound of a witch flying on her broomstick. However, there is no primary documentation backing this speculation up at all, despite it being almost universally repeated. And for our part, we're just guessing not a single German soldier ever actually had heard the whooshing sound of a witch flying on a broomstick to compare. So allow us to suggest our own alternate hypothesis that it wasn't so much the sound that was the inspiration, but instead the nickname the Night Witches was actually because these were women flying at night on aircraft made of wood, not unlike a witch flying on a broomstick. Whatever the case, in the end, for their heroism, almost 1 in 10 of the women of the 588th were honored with the Hero of the Soviet Union Award. For reference here, while that award was given out almost 13,000 times over the entire life of the Soviet Union, the incredible women of the 588th accounted for approximately 1 in 4 of all women who ever received it.
It's a scene which is played out in countless films. An aircraft loses control and snaps into a fatal nosedive. As it plummets earthwards, falling faster and faster, the air fills with a sickening drone, growing louder and more high-pitched until it becomes a shrill banshee wail. This shriek reaches ear-splitting crescendo just as the plane slams into the ground with an almighty bang, throwing up a roiling column of orange flame and black smoke. So much of a trope this scene is that you can be forgiven in thinking that this is a sound actual aircrafts make when they dive and crash. But alas, once again, Hollywood has lied to you. Shocking, I know. For while the drone of a diving aircraft's propeller or jet engine may get louder and more high-pitched as it accelerates and approaches the ground, and the air rushing over the airframe may produce a low whistling sound, outside of sounds the passengers are probably making inside as the plane plummets, almost no aircraft will provide the classic movie shriek. So why then does Hollywood, and by extension we, think that all aircraft sound this way? Well, it's all thanks to one infamous aircraft that actually did make this noise. So let's dive into it, shall we? On September 1st, 1939, a Nazi invasion force of 2 million men, 2,750 tanks, and 2,300 aircraft stormed over the border in Poland, overwhelming the defending Polish forces and overrunning the country in a mere 35 days. Popularly known as Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, but more properly termed something I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce in German, but in English, maneuver warfare, German tactical doctrine relied on two main elements: rapid advance by mechanized units and close fire support by ground attack aircraft. And no aircraft was more closely associated with the Blitzkrieg than iconic Junkers, the Ju-87 Stuka. First flown in 1935, the Stuka was designed around the newly developed doctrine of dive bombing. Unlike conventional level bombing, which with the crude bomb sights of the time was woefully inaccurate, dive bombing allowed pilots to use the entire aircraft to aim their bombs, allowing for precision low-level strikes. Achieving this precision, however, required Stuka pilots to perform a truly punishing sequence of maneuvers. Upon spotting his target through a bomb sight in the cockpit floor, the pilot rolled the aircraft, inverted, and pulled back on the controls, entering a near vertical dive towards the target. Then, at a predetermined altitude, the pilot released the bomb and pulled out of the dive. This maneuver subjected Stuka pilots to up to 8 Gs, pulling blood away from their brains and causing their vision to dim or gray out. Though most Luftwaffe pilots were young and fit, without modern G-suits or anti-G training, exposure to such accelerations for more than a few seconds could cause them to lose consciousness entirely, with often fatal results, as you might imagine. Meanwhile, the gunner and radio operator in the rear seat had to endure the whole ordeal facing backwards, helpless and hoping the pilot would be able to recover in time in order to withstand the punishing conditions and operate on rough forward airfields. The Stuka was designed to be as robust as possible, with rugged fixed landing gear covered with streamlined fairing or spats. The wing was cranked down in a distinctive inverted gull wing shape to reduce the length of the landing gear struts and improve the pilot's view of the ground, and was fitted with slotted dive brakes to limit the aircraft's vertical speed and special flaps to automatically pull it out of dives. The Stuka first saw service in 1936 in the Spanish Civil War, where it was flown by volunteers of the German Condor Legion in support of Generalissimo Francisco Franco's nationalist forces. The aircraft proved devastatingly effective and was highly feared by Republican forces and Spanish civilians alike. And when Germany invaded Poland in 1939 and France in 1940, the Stuka was right on the front lines leading the advance. But while swarms of dive bombers swoop down and raining death and destruction are terrifying enough, the Stuka made a particular impression thanks to its secret weapon, the Jericho trumpet. Named after the Old Testament story in which the Israelites under Joshua brought down the walls of Jericho by following God's command and marching around blowing ram's horns, the Jericho trumpet was a small propeller-driven siren mounted to the Stuka's landing gear struts, which produced a terrifying high-pitched shriek as the aircraft dived toward its target. The device was designed to instill terror and dread in enemy forces, and in this it was extremely effective, with French General Eduardo Ruby describing its paralyzing effects in 1940. They, the French artillerymen, simply stopped firing and went to the ground. The infantry cowered in the trenches, dazed by the crash of bombs and the shriek of the dime bombers. The iconic shriek was widely featured in Nazi propaganda newsreels and burned itself into the minds of those who heard it and survived, helping to turn the sound of the Stuka into the faces of German Blitzkrieg terror-bombing tactics. Indeed, the shriek became so iconic that at some point Hollywood sound designers began using it to indicate any diving aircraft, and an enduring cinematic cliché was born. This is rather ironic given the relatively short service life of the Jericho trumpet, which despite its fearsome reputation suffered from a number of shortcomings. For one thing, it produced so much drag that it slowed down the aircraft by 10 knots or approximately 12 miles per hour. While not a huge amount technically, every bit of speed was important for avoiding enemy aircraft fire, and while its Banshee rail initially terrified and paralyzed enemy forces, it soon became a liability, giving troops advanced warning of Stuka attack and giving them time to take cover or otherwise get ready with their anti-aircraft guns. Before long, Luftwaffe squadrons began disabling the devices or removing them from their aircraft entirely. Brief, too, was the Stuka's reign as the terror of the battlefield. While highly effective against unarmed civilians or on battlefields where Luftwaffe had total air superiority against modern fighter aircraft like the British Hawker Hurricane or Supermarine Spitfire, the slow and clumsy Stuka was a sitting duck, and in the opening days of the 1940 Battle of Britain, Luftwaffe dive bomber squadrons were all but wiped out by the Royal Air Force. Nonetheless, the venerable Stuka soldiered on until the end of the war. By the time more modern ground attack aircraft like the Focke-Wulf 190 became available in sufficient numbers, the war for Germany was already lost. But while the stock diving scream featured in movies is clearly modeled on the wail of the Stuka's Jericho trumpet, there were indeed a handful of World War II aircraft that wailed, whistled, and screeched without any form of mechanical assistance. For example, the American Douglas SPD Dauntless dive bomber produced a high-pitched wail as it dived due to the air flowing through its perforated dive brakes. So distinctive was this sound that in the U.S. Army Air Force service, the aircraft was known as the A-24 Banshee. The Vought F-4U Corsair fighter also produced a distinctive sound thanks to air flowing through its wing-mounted oil coolers, earning the aircraft the nickname the Whistling Death. Another related stock sound effect which has shown up in countless movies is the high-pitched descending whistle of a bomb or artillery shell falling to the earth. Here again, the Nazis are to blame for this enduring cliché. For once the Jericho sirens started being removed from Stuka dive bombers, the Luftwaffe began fitting whistles to bombs instead, achieving the same terrorizing effect without the accompanying reduction in performance. Such devices were widely copied by other nations. For example, the American version was known as the Bomb Whistle Mark I Mod 1 and was produced by the Ohio Art Company, a toy manufacturer based in Bryan, Ohio. Yet unmodified bomb and shells can still make noises approximating the stock sound effect. In the case of bombs, the sound is caused by air passing through lightning holes cut into the stabilizing fins, or by the thin sheet metal fins themselves vibrating in the airstream. In artillery shells, the sound is typically produced by the driving band, the soft copper band that engages with the cannon's rifling to make the shell spin, interacting with the passing airstream. Indeed, during the First World War, soldiers identified different shells by the distinctive sounds they made, assigning them colorful nicknames like carpet slipper, mouth organ, wipers express, and whiz bang. Smaller shells tended to whistle as they flew past, while larger, heavier shells made a whooshing noise likened to a freight train passing by. However, only low-velocity, high-arcing shells fired from howitzers and trench mortars give such convenient warning of their arrival. Longer-range and direct-fire artillery shells tend to travel faster than the speed of sound, meaning they have already exploded by the time you hear the sound of their flight. As one Vietnam War veteran recalled, "The whistling sound that is made by incoming artillery shells is only heard when the round goes over your head. The whistle sounds that last 2 or 3 seconds, like the ones on old war movies, are artillery shells you don't worry too much about. Those shells would land hundreds of feet from you. The shells that would actually get you were the ones that whistled only for a fraction of a second before hitting the ground. But in that fraction of a second, your mind would hear the whistle very clearly. Measure the length of the sound, calculate how close to you it would land, and give you time to think about it. When the incoming shells didn't go over you, the sound of the explosion was quite different. If the explosion was close, it sounded like a wham, like someone hitting a sheet of corrugated steel with something heavy. The sound became less wham-like and more sharp, like a heavy crack, the further the explosion was from you. If the shells landed close to you, you heard a thud as the shell impacted the ground. This was closely followed by the sudden outward movement of air and the sound wave of the explosion which followed it. Immediately following the sound wave, you would hear strange little noises overhead as the pieces of shrapnel tumbled and flew through the air. These are sounds that you never forget. Yet, despite being grounded in reality, the stock movie bomb whistle invariably gets one thing dead wrong: the steadily descending pitch as the bomb gets closer, due to the Doppler effect wherein sound waves are compressed ahead of moving objects and stretched out behind it. When heard from the ground, the pitch of a dropping bomb should get higher, not lower. However, when heard from the bomber aircraft, the pitch would get steadily lower, matching the stock sound. It is thus more likely that the Hollywood sound effect was based on recordings taken aboard bomber aircraft. Now how about a bonus fact? Though the Jericho trumpet may have been short-lived in actual service, its psychological impact was such that after the war, the American CIA went to surprising lengths to create their own version. On May 8, 1958, an unknown CIA officer penned a handwritten memo requesting the development of a siren or screamer-type noisemaker for psychological warfare that could be fitted to a North American P-51 Mustang fighter and would be sufficiently incapacitating to enemy ground troops from an altitude of 300 feet. In September of that year, the request received the official designation of Task S. As a starting point, the project officers decided to copy the German wartime Jericho trumpet. However, tracking down the infamous device proved more difficult than expected. Though the Germans built 6,000 Stukas during the war, by 1958 there were only 2 surviving examples anywhere in the world, one at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago and one at the Royal Air Force Museum in London, neither of which was fitted with Jericho trumpets. Neither did any museum appear to have a detached siren in the collection. Thankfully, however, the CIA had a secret weapon, Operation Paperclip, the post-war effort to import Nazi scientists and engineers to work in the American defense industry. Combing through the paperclip records, the agency located the Jericho trumpet's original designer, Henning von Gerck, working at the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. Von Gerck provided drawings and design notes for the device, allowing the CIA to engineer their own improved version, featuring a variable intake that could be controlled from the cockpit to adjust the airflow and sound output. The CIA's noisemaker was tested in January of 1959 aboard a Beechcraft AT-11 training aircraft. Unfortunately, performance proved disappointing. While at close range, the device could put out 180 decibels, well above the pain threshold for most humans. On the ground, this dropped to only 108 decibels, about as loud as a chainsaw and not very frightening. As the CIA report on the flight test stated, in the present state, this whistle cannot be considered as a harassment item. It does, however, attract attention. Upon hearing the whistle for the first time, and completely unaware that any such device was being tested, a charter pilot who flew the undersigned to the test site was of the opinion that either the oil or the fuel pump of the test aircraft was failing. He expressed concern for fear the test aircraft might crash due to motor failure. Although this unbiased witness was concerned about the noise, he was not frightened to any degree. The CIA considered retooling the device to help covertly identify friendly aircraft for ground forces, but ultimately concluded that if this whistle cannot serve any useful purpose as a psychological identification device, it is our recommendation that this project be dropped. 2 prototype whistles have been fabricated under this program, and any recommendations as to their disposal would be appreciated. But this was not the end of the United States Cold War experiments with sound-based psychological warfare. In 1966, the U.S. Air Force's Special Operations Center at the Eglin Air Force Base in Florida began working on a strange device nicknamed the Screaming Mimi, combination noisemaker and landmine. Contained in an airdroppable aluminum box, the device consisted of a loud siren with 4 loudspeakers, 1 for each side of the box, and a 25-pound charge of high explosives. The Screaming Mimi's battery could keep the siren running for up to 12 hours, while an anti-handling booby trap device could detonate the explosive charge if someone tried to move it or if the battery charge dropped below a certain level. Specifically designed for use in Vietnam, the intent was to drop large numbers of Screaming Mimis into enemy-held territory where the wailing sirens and random explosions would harass and demoralize North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong forces. Unfortunately, just like the CIA airborne noisemaker before it, in testing the Screaming Mimi proved something of a dud, the device being barely able to generate 130 decibels. Describing the effect as to, quote, more entertaining than frightening, the Air Force canceled the project and relegated the Screaming Mimi to the dustbin of history. Just one of many bizarre and failed weapons to come out of the Vietnam War. And for more on another bizarre weapon that was actually used during the war, please check out our video on our sister channel, Today I Found Out. That time, the U.S. Army tried to defeat the Vietnamese using body odor.
Initially designed and produced during World War II for British soldiers, the Sten was developed as a direct response to both dwindling supplies of American-made Thompson machine guns and the evacuation of Dunkirk, during which the British abandoned many thousands of guns. In efforts to rearm its troops as quickly as possible for the defence of the homeland, the British government requested that the Royal Small Arms Factory in Enfield design an alternative to the increasingly hard-to-obtain Thompson. So there's this old maxim which states, well, you can have it fast, you can have it good, or cheap. Pick 2. Given the title of this video, you can probably guess which 2 of these were emphasized by the British government. The original design for the Sten is chiefly credited to 2 men, Major R.V. Shepherd and Harold Turpin, who finalized the design in the closing months of 1940. The first Sten prototype, it was reportedly of reasonably high quality for what it was. It featured a flash hider, a foregrip, as well as having wooden finishing that gave the gun a rather sleek appearance. So about 100,000 of these were produced in the summer of 1941 before the government decided to strip the already Spartan Sten down in order to save money, materials, and reduce the build time even further. Well, the result, that would be the rather creatively named Sten Mark II. Just a few months after it entered production, the Mark II became both the bane and the boon of many an Allied soldier's life. On the one hand, the Sten Mark II could be produced for less than $10, which is about $160 today, and in about 5 man-hours. In contrast, by the way, the Thompson cost $140, which is about $2,300 today to produce. Not only that, but the Sten used only 2 machined parts, the barrel and the bolt, with the rest being made, as a 1943 edition of Popular Science put it, from the cheapest kind of stamping. Initially, the design even used common bed springs as a main component. With the help of assembly lines, all total, an estimated 2 million Sten Mark IIs were produced during the war, and approximately 4 million total in the Sten line of guns. Due to its simplistic design, the Sten Mark II was remarkably easy to maintain and required virtually no lubrication to function properly. In fact, the construction was so simple that resistance fighters who couldn't get their hands on the genuine article even sometimes simply just made their own. Another great benefit of the Sten's jury-rigged design was that it could be easily customized to accept magazines from other guns. Indeed, you could also just whack a different type of silencer or even a different viewing sight on the thing. The ammunition for the gun was also very easy to come by, given that the Mark II was significantly designed to use the 9mm German parabellum bullets, which were the most commonly used round by various European militaries. Needless to say, they were readily available to resistance fighters in Nazi-occupied territories, particularly as the Germans started to retreat. The Mark II was also literally murder in close combat, able to fire off rounds at a rate of 500 to 550 per minute, although its clip only held 32 rounds. It was also relatively accurate up to 100 meters if one held a firm grip and used short bursts. It was also light and it was easy to conceal. Essentially, the weapon was ideal for taking out many enemy soldiers at close range, and if you surprised them, perhaps even before they'd have a chance to raise their weapons. Alright, well, all of this sounds pretty amazing so far, so what exactly was the problem with this gun? Well, if you, say, bumped the gun hard enough, or just dropped it, or even just set it down a bit too firmly, it had a tendency to fire on its own. What's worse is that it would sometimes do that in fully automatic mode. Indeed, it would unload the entire clip in a moment of self-firing frenzy. Beyond the main gun firing when soldiers didn't want it to, it was also ridiculously prone to not firing when they did want it to. This was due to an inherent flaw in the magazine's feed design, which was intentionally based on the magazines used by the German MP-38. The reason they modeled it off this German gun was so that it would have various compatibilities. The problem with this design was that it used a double-column single-feed mechanism, meaning 2 columns of bullets would have to merge into one for firing, requiring an extremely precise feed angle in order to work. This is in contrast to the double-column double-feed design in the much more reliable Thompson. The former is still fine if the parts are well manufactured and sturdy, but the Sten parts were pretty much anything but that, particularly in the early going when the British were desperate to churn out as many of the guns as possible and had little in the way of quality control. For this reason, Canadian-produced Mark IIs were noted as being much more reliable than their British equivalents. Indeed, the jamming problem was so bad that it was common for soldiers to extensively test-fire each of the Stens that they were issued before trying to use them in combat. Units that were determined to be more prone to jamming than others were simply tossed aside. But even if you had a Mark II that seemed to perform well at first, small amounts of dirt or other debris could cause the guns to jam, which was a particular problem in the muddy conditions prevalent across the European front. This problem was greatly exacerbated by the fact that the long opening that the cocking knob ran along readily allowed for such debris to enter the gun. So the most notable example of a Sten Mark II jamming at an inopportune time was in the assassination attempt of SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich. This occurred during Operation Anthropoid on May 27, 1942. The assassins waited along Heydrich's normal daily commute, which would necessarily pass a certain bend where they knew the car would have to slow to a near stop. In a move that later resulted in Hitler calling Heydrich an idiot, Heydrich chose to drive his daily commute in an open-top Mercedes rather than in an armored car. As such, when the exposed car reached the bend in the road, one of the would-be assassins, Joseph Gabchik, pointed his Sten Mark II at Heydrich at near point-blank range. He pulled the trigger, and the Sten gun did what it was wont to do, and that would be jam. Luckily for the assassins, rather than telling him to speed off, Heydrich told his driver to stop so he could go after the attackers. While Heydrich did eventually manage a rousing chase, when the car stopped, one of the other assassins, Jan Kubisch, chucked a modified anti-tank mine at it. The resulting explosion and shrapnel severely injured Heydrich's spleen, left lung, diaphragm, and also fractured a rib. Nevertheless, bleeding profusely, he still chased his attackers for a time before becoming too weak from his injuries. Later, surgery was partially successful in that he survived at first and that his wounds began to heal, but a few days later he succumbed to infection and died. Despite its many problems, the Sten Mark II played a significant role in the Allies' early efforts in World War II, managing to put an exceptionally deadly close-range weapon in the hands of Allied fighters instead of the hunting and bolt-action rifles left over from World War I, which were all that some soldiers had to use before the Mark II. That said, the stent's importance didn't stop soldiers from giving it colourful nicknames like the Stench Gun, the Plumber's Nightmare, and the Woolworths Wonder. The latter name there, the Woolworths Wonder, is named after a British retail chain which is known for selling cheap toys and gifts.